Hey guys, tonight we begin with a Sunday morning. One so deceptively calm, so ordinary and so precisely engineered for catastrophe that it still makes historians pause mid-sentence 70 plus years later. December 7th, 1941. 7:48 a.m. Oahu, Hawaii. The kind of morning where the Pacific Ocean looks like a tourism brochure and the sky has the audacity to be cloudless and blue. The kind of morning where American sailors are eating breakfast, writing letters home and making plans for shore leave. The kind of morning that has absolutely no idea it's about to become a date that will live in infamy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you want to understand Pearl Harbor, you can't start with the bombs. No, you start with an empire that looked at the entire Pacific Ocean and thought, yeah, we could use that. You start with Japan in the 1930s, a nation that had successfully speedrun modernization in about 60 years, and was now looking around at its neighbours with what can only be described as aggressive real estate ambitions. Because here's the thing about Japan's position in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They'd watched European powers carve up Asia like it was a Thanksgiving turkey. They'd seen Britain take chunks of China. They'd witnessed France establish colonies in Indochina. They'd observed the Dutch settle into Indonesia like they owned the place, which technically they did. And Japan, having just emerged from centuries of self-imposed isolation, looked at this imperial buffet and decided they wanted a seat at the table. Call it survival instinct. Call it naked imperialism. Call it a perfectly rational response to watching every other major power grab territory and resources while you're still figuring out how trains work. Japan modernized with the kind of intensity that makes contemporary industrialization look like a casual hobby. They imported Western technology, reorganized their military along European lines, and generally transformed from a feudal society to an industrial power in the time it takes most nations to argue about constitutional amendments. The result? By the early 20th century, Japan had become the first non-Western power to defeat a European nation in modern warfare. They beat Russia in 1905, which shocked everyone, including the Russians, who apparently hadn't considered that maybe sailing your entire Baltic fleet around the world for 7 months to fight the Japanese Navy wasn't the strategic masterstroke it sounded like on paper. But Japan won, and suddenly they had Korea. Then they had Manchuria, then they had Taiwan, and then they looked at China and thought, you know what, we could probably just take more. Meanwhile, the United States sat across the Pacific Ocean, doing what America always did in the 1930s, which is to say, absolutely nothing that resembled coherent foreign policy. The US was deep in isolationist mood, still recovering from the Great Depression, still traumatized from World War I, and generally committed to the idea that European and Asian problems were European and Asian problems. America's official position on Japanese expansion was essentially thoughts and prayers, with a side of stern diplomatic notes that Japan filed directly into the garbage. But here's where it gets interesting. Because while America was busy pretending that oceans were permanent shields against international conflict, Japan was busy invading China. Not just invading, committing atrocities. The rape of Nanking in 1937 was so horrific that even Nazi Germany's representative in China was like, hey, maybe dial it back a little, which is possibly the most damning historical assessment anyone could receive. The United States responded with what they always respond with when they want to look like they're doing something without actually doing anything: economic sanctions, oil embargoes, steel restrictions, freezing Japanese assets, the diplomatic equivalent of passive-aggressive post-it notes. But here's the problem with economic sanctions against an expansionist empire. They only work if the empire decides to stop expanding, and Japan's entire economic model was built on expansion. They needed resources. They needed oil. They needed rubber, tin, rice, everything they didn't have on their relatively small island nation. Which is medieval, for we've created a situation where war is now more attractive than peace. Japan looked at their options. Option 1, withdraw from China, abandon their imperial ambitions, accept American and European dominance in the Pacific, and return to being a regional power with limited resources. Option 2, go to war with the United States, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and hope that America's isolationist tendencies would prevent a prolonged conflict. One option involved national humiliation and economic collapse. The other involved aircraft carriers and extremely optimistic strategic planning. They picked door number 2, because apparently when you've spent 40 years building an empire and your entire national identity is wrapped up in military expansion and divine destiny, backing down starts to look like civilizational suicide. The decision wasn't made by crazy people. It was made by rational actors working within a completely insane framework, which is how most catastrophic historical decisions happen. Enter Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who knew more about America than most Japanese officials because he'd actually lived there. He'd studied at Harvard, he'd travelled across the United States, he'd seen American industrial capacity up close, and his assessment of war with America was roughly, this is a terrible idea that will end badly for us. But if we're going to do this terrible idea anyway, we need to do it with such overwhelming force at the beginning that maybe, just maybe, America will decide it's not worth the trouble to fight back. Which is how you get Pearl Harbor, not as a strategy for victory, but as a strategy for buying time. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity and absolutely deranged in its assumptions. Strike the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, cripple their ability to respond, seize Southeast Asia's resources, establish a defensive perimeter across the Pacific, and hope that by the time America rebuilt its fleet, Japan would be too entrenched to dislodge without years of costly warfare that the American public wouldn't support. The operation was called Operation AI, which is Japanese for ambush. Later changed to Operation Z, which sounds like something a 12-year-old would name their secret mission, but actually referred to the Z flag flown by Admiral Togo at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. The flag meant, the fate of the empire rests on this battle. No pressure, though. Planning began in January 1941, almost a full year before the attack. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was methodical. Commander Minoru Genda designed the tactical approach. Yamamoto refined it. They studied American defences. They analysed reconnaissance photographs. They practised on models. They rehearsed over and over in Kagoshima Bay, which conveniently resembled Pearl Harbor's geography. The challenges were significant. Pearl Harbor is shallow. Standard aerial torpedoes would bury themselves in the mud before reaching ships. Solution: modify the torpedoes with wooden fins to keep them running shallow. The harbour is crowded, ships are packed together. Solution: that's not a problem, that's a target-rich environment. American defences might detect the attack force. Solution: approach from the north, maintain radio silence, pray that the weather cooperates and that American patrol patterns don't extend far enough to spot 6 aircraft carriers and their escort ships. Because yes, 6 carriers. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. The core of Japan's carrier fleet, sailing together in a formation called the Kido Butai, which is Japanese for Mobile Strike Force, which is Japanese for we're betting everything on this working. They left Japan in late November 1941, taking a northern route through the Pacific where merchant shipping was minimal and American patrols were non-existent. The fleet maintained absolute radio silence. No transmissions, no communications, nothing that could reveal their position. Meanwhile, back in Japan, radio operators broadcast fake messages to create the impression that the carriers were still in home waters, conducting routine training. The diplomatic corps in Washington continued negotiations with the US government, acting like peace was still possible, while 6 carriers carrying more than 400 aircraft steamed toward Hawaii. And Hawaii had no idea. None. American intelligence knew war was coming. They knew Japan was mobilizing. They knew diplomatic relations were deteriorating. What they didn't know was where or when. The Philippines seemed likely. Maybe Thailand, possibly Malaya. Pearl Harbor? That seemed improbable. Too far from Japan. Too well defended. Too risky. Except Pearl Harbor wasn't well defended. Not really. The base had radar, but the radar operators were trainees who'd been told to shut down the equipment at 7 a.m. each morning. The base had patrol aircraft, but they mostly flew south and west, not north where the Japanese fleet was approaching. The base had anti-aircraft guns, but the ammunition was locked up to prevent accidents. The ships were arranged in neat rows along Battleship Row, which made for impressive photographs and catastrophically easy targeting. The Americans had broken Japanese diplomatic codes. They knew Japan was going to break off negotiations. They sent warnings to Pacific commanders, but the warnings were vague. Be alert. War is imminent. The Philippines is the most likely target. Pearl Harbor wasn't mentioned. On the night of December 6, 1941, American sailors in Pearl Harbor were enjoying Saturday evening. Movies, card games, shore leave in Honolulu. Some were sleeping, some were drinking. None were particularly worried about Japanese attack because why would they be? Hawaii was thousands of miles from Japan. The Pacific Ocean is really, really big, and America wasn't at war. The Japanese strike force, meanwhile, was 500 miles north of Oahu, preparing for dawn launch. Pilots were given final briefings. Aircraft were positioned on carrier decks. Torpedoes were loaded. Bombs were armed. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Everyone knew this would change everything. The speech to the pilots reportedly included the phrase, "The rise or fall of our empire depends on this battle. No pressure." First wave, 183 aircraft. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, high-altitude bombers. Launched at 6 a.m. from the carrier decks, forming up in the pre-dawn darkness, then heading south toward Oahu. The flight took about 90 minutes. The pilots could see Pearl Harbor from miles away. The morning was clear. Visibility was perfect. The harbor was exactly where it was supposed to be, filled with ships arranged in neat, convenient rows. At 7:02 a.m., the Opana Point radar station detected the incoming aircraft. The operators reported it. The officer receiving the report assumed they were American B-17 bombers, scheduled to arrive from California that morning. Stand down, no threat, go back to training. The radar operators shrugged and shut down their equipment at 7 a.m. like they were supposed to. At 7:48 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fushida, leading the first wave, confirmed visual contact with the harbor and transmitted the signal, "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger," the code phrase meaning we have achieved complete surprise, which they had. Completely. Totally. Absolutely. The first bombs hit at 7:55 a.m. Not bombs, actually. Torpedoes. Modified aerial torpedoes designed to run in shallow water, launched from Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, flying low over the water. They hit the battleships moored along the southeast shore of Ford Island. The USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes in rapid succession and began capsizing. The USS West Virginia took 6 or 7 torpedoes, depending on who you ask, and started settling into the mud. The USS California took 2 torpedoes and began flooding. Dive bombers hit next. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers screaming down from altitude, releasing armor-piercing bombs converted from naval shells. The USS Arizona took a bomb through the forward deck that detonated in the forward magazine. The explosion was so massive it lifted the entire bow of the ship out of the water. The ship went from functional battleship to blazing wreck in seconds. 1,177 men died on the Arizona, most of them in the first few minutes. The explosion was so violent that it was felt miles away, and the fireball was visible across the harbor. Meanwhile, American sailors were trying to figure out what was happening. Some thought it was a drill, a very realistic drill with actual explosions. Others recognized Japanese markings on the aircraft and realized this was not a drill. This was not practice. This was actual war happening right now without warning or declaration. The second wave arrived at 8:54 a.m. Another 171 aircraft. More bombs, more torpedoes, more strafing runs on airfields where American planes were parked wingtip to wingtip, because the base commander was more worried about sabotage than air attack, which in retrospect was extremely unfortunate defensive prioritization. By the time the attack ended around 9:45 a.m., the Pacific Fleet was devastated. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, 403 Americans dead, 1,078 wounded. And the Japanese had achieved this with 29 aircraft lost, 1 submarine sunk, and 5 midget submarines destroyed. It was, from a tactical perspective, an overwhelming success. From a strategic perspective, it was the worst decision Japan ever made, because Yamamoto was right about American industrial capacity, but wrong about American resolve. The attack didn't convince America to stay out of the war. It convinced America to enter the war with the kind of focused fury that only comes from getting sucker-punched on a Sunday morning while eating breakfast. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The speech lasted 6 minutes. The vote for war took 33 minutes. One dissenting vote, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist, who had also voted against entry into World War I. Everyone else said yes immediately, and just like that, America was at war. Not the cautious, reluctant entry into World War I, not the measured diplomatic escalation, full commitment, total war, the kind of unified national response that only happens when someone attacks you at home without warning while you're in your pajamas. But here's what makes the Pearl Harbor story even stranger. The attack, for all its tactical brilliance, missed the most important targets. The 3 Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, Lexington and Saratoga, were not in port that morning. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was heading toward Midway. Saratoga was in California. Pure luck. Complete accident. Japan also failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities. 6 million barrels of oil sitting in above-ground tanks, completely undefended, absolutely critical to Pacific Fleet operations. The Japanese strike force could have crippled American naval operations in the Pacific for years by destroying those fuel tanks. They didn't. They focused on the battleships, which were impressive and symbolic but increasingly obsolete in an era of carrier warfare. They also didn't destroy the repair facilities, the massive dry docks, the machine shops, the maintenance infrastructure that would allow America to salvage and repair damaged ships far faster than Japan anticipated. The USS California, damaged in the attack, was repaired and returned to service. The USS West Virginia, torpedoed and sunk in shallow water, was refloated, repaired, and eventually participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Even the USS Nevada, which tried to make a run for the harbour entrance during the attack and was deliberately beached to prevent blocking the channel, was refloated and repaired. Of the 8 battleships damaged in the attack, 6 returned to service. 6. The only total losses were the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma, and even the Oklahoma might have been salvageable if the repair effort had been prioritised differently. Japan knocked out the Pacific Fleet for about 6 months. They needed to knock it out for 2 years. And then there's the human element. The attack killed 2,403 Americans, which is a horrific number. But it also created 2,403 reasons for Americans to support the war effort with absolute determination. Every person who died at Pearl Harbor became a name on a memorial, a story in a newspaper, a motivation for someone to enlist, to work in a factory, to buy war bonds, to support the effort. Japan wanted to shock America into negotiation. They shocked America into fury. The strategic calculation was completely backwards. Yamamoto reportedly said after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether he actually said that is debated by historians, but the sentiment was accurate. Japan had 6 months of victories after Pearl Harbor. They swept through Southeast Asia. They took the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. They established their defensive perimeter exactly as planned. And then America showed up with the industrial capacity of a continent, the resources of a superpower, and the focused anger of a nation that really doesn't like being attacked without warning. The Japanese plan assumed America would get tired, would negotiate, would accept Japanese dominance in Asia rather than fight a long, costly war. They were betting on American isolationism outlasting American anger. They lost that bet. By 1945, Japan's cities were burning, its fleet was destroyed, its empire was collapsing, and 2 atomic bombs had demonstrated exactly what happens when you wake up a sleeping giant who has also invented nuclear weapons. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military attack. It was a strategic miscalculation so profound that it defined the entire Pacific War. Japan won the battle. They lost everything else. To be in port. The Japanese would need precise intelligence about ship locations, defensive positions, and patrol schedules. Gender's solution was elegant and terrifying. He proposed using 6 aircraft carriers loaded with torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. The carriers would approach from the north, where American reconnaissance was weakest, maintaining radio silence the entire way. At dawn on a Sunday morning, when crews would be at minimal readiness, they would launch everything they had in 2 waves. First wave would hit the battleships and airfields. Second wave would finish whatever survived. The torpedo bombers were the key. Pearl Harbor's depth was only 40 feet in most places, which was considered too shallow for conventional aerial torpedoes. Drop a standard torpedo from a plane, and it would dive to 60 or 80 feet before levelling out, which meant it would just bury itself in the harbour bottom. Useless. The Japanese solved this by modifying their Type 91 torpedoes with wooden fins that kept them shallow. They tested them obsessively, fine-tuning the release altitude and angle until they could reliably run at less than 40 feet depth. It was the kind of technical problem-solving that military engineers excel at, especially when the alternative is telling your admiral that his entire battle plan won't work. Training began in early 1941. Pilots practiced on Kagoshima Bay, which resembled Pearl Harbor's geography. They flew mock attack runs until they could hit target ships with their eyes closed. Torpedo bomber pilots trained to release at exactly the right altitude and speed. Dive bomber pilots practiced hitting moving targets from steep angles. Fighter pilots drilled on strafing runs against parked aircraft. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence gathered information on Pearl Harbor through multiple sources. The consulate in Honolulu sent regular reports on ship movements. A spy named Takeo, Yoshikawa, posing as a consular official, made detailed observations of the fleet's routines, noting which ships were in port on which days, when they typically returned from exercises, where they moored. He couldn't get onto the base itself, but he could watch from public areas and piece together patterns. By fall 1941, the Japanese had a comprehensive picture of Pearl Harbor's defences and the Pacific Fleet's routines. They knew the fleet typically returned to port on weekends. They knew the battleships moored along the eastern side of Ford Island in a formation sailors called Battleship Row. They knew aircraft were parked closely together at airfields to prevent sabotage, which made them perfect targets for strafing runs. They knew Sunday morning was when crew readiness would be at its lowest. The strike force assembled in Hitakapu Bay in the Kuril Islands in late November 1941. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaiga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shikaku, and Zuikaku. 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines for screening, 8 oil tankers for refueling. In total, over 30 ships carrying 414 aircraft and more than 10,000 men, all preparing for an operation that would either cripple American naval power or become a spectacular failure. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the strike force. Nagumo was not Yamamoto's first choice. He was a cautious, by-the-book officer who had never commanded carriers in combat, but he was senior, experienced, and available, so he got the job. Yamamoto's instructions were clear. Approach undetected, strike hard, withdraw immediately. Do not linger. Do not get drawn into a surface battle. Hit and run. On November 26, 1941, the strike force departed Hitakapu Bay. They sailed east, then south, following a route across the North Pacific where merchant shipping was minimal and American patrols were rare. Radio silence was absolute. No transmissions, no lights at night. The weather was miserable. Rough seas, heavy clouds, occasional storms. Perfect for staying hidden. Back in Washington and Tokyo, diplomats were still talking. Japanese envoys met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, presenting proposals and counter-proposals. The Americans demanded Japan withdraw from China and Indochina. The Japanese insisted on maintaining their territorial gains. Both sides knew the negotiations were going nowhere, but they continued because the alternative was admitting war was inevitable. What the Americans didn't know was that the Japanese government had already set a deadline. If negotiations didn't produce an acceptable agreement by November 29th, the military would proceed with war plans. When November 29th passed with no agreement, the attack on Pearl Harbor became irreversible. The strike force was already at sea, too far committed to recall. The fleet crossed the Pacific in complete radio silence. Weather remained poor, which helped conceal them but made refueling difficult. Tankers transferred. Fuel to warships while both ships steamed through heavy swells, which is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Several ships reported refueling accidents, but nothing catastrophic. They pressed on. American intelligence was picking up signs that something was happening. They'd broken Japanese diplomatic codes and new negotiations were failing. They'd detected increased Japanese military activity across the Pacific. They'd issued war warnings to commanders in Hawaii, the Philippines, and elsewhere, advising them that hostilities might begin at any moment. But nobody in American intelligence expected an attack on Pearl Harbor itself. The prevailing assumption was that if Japan struck, they'd hit the Philippines, or possibly British or Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia. Pearl Harbor seemed too far, too well defended, too risky. The logistics alone seemed impossible. To cross the Pacific, refuel multiple times, and launch a successful surprise attack against the main American naval base seemed like something out of a war game, not a realistic military operation. Lieutenant General Walter Short, commanding U.S. Army forces in Hawaii, received the war warning and responded by focusing on sabotage prevention. He ordered aircraft parked close together at airfields so they could be more easily guarded. Ammunition was locked up to prevent theft. Anti-aircraft guns remained unmanned because it was peacetime and nobody had ordered full combat readiness. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commanding the Pacific Fleet, took the warning more seriously but made a critical assumption. He believed that if war came, there would be some warning. Perhaps a declaration of war, perhaps detection of Japanese ships approaching. He didn't think they would just appear out of nowhere on a Sunday morning. His intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese couldn't conduct carrier operations that far from home waters. It was a reasonable assumption based on available information. It was also completely wrong. On December the 6th, 1941, the strike force reached its launch point about 230 miles north of Oahu. Seas were still rough, but clearing. Nagumo gave the final attack order. Crews began preparing aircraft, arming torpedoes, loading bombs, fueling planes. The mood was tense but determined. They'd trained for this. They'd crossed the Pacific undetected. Now they just needed to execute. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave launched. 183 aircraft took off from 6 carriers in the pre-dawn darkness. 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighters. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the attack force. His orders were simple: destroy the American battleships, neutralize the airfields, cause maximum damage. The signal to attack would be Tora, 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 which means tiger, 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 and sounds way more dramatic in Japanese. The aircraft flew south through clouds and morning twilight. Pilots maintained formation, watching for landmarks. At 7:40 a.m., they spotted the northern coast of Oahu. Fuchida looked down and saw Pearl Harbor spread out below. Battleships lined up along Ford Island, aircraft parked on airfields, sailors going about their Sunday morning routines. No alarm, no signs of alert, complete surprise. Fuchida sent the attack signal, Tora! 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 The Americans had actually detected something earlier that morning. At 7:02 a.m., 2 Army privates operating a mobile radar station at Opana Point picked up a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. They reported it to the information center, where a lieutenant told them it was probably a group of B-17 bombers expected to arrive from California that morning. The radar operators shrugged and shut down their equipment. Their shift was over anyway. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fell on Wheeler Field, one of Oahu's main airfields. Dive bombers screamed down on parked aircraft, which were lined up wingtip to wingtip for easy sabotage prevention. Call it target practice. The P-40 and P-36 fighters never had a chance. They exploded, burned, or were shredded by machine gun fire before their pilots could reach them. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers approached Battleship Row at low altitude. The battleships were moored in pairs along Ford Island's eastern shore. Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Oklahoma, California. 8 battleships in total, representing the core of the Pacific Fleet's firepower. They sat there like targets at a shooting range, which is essentially what they'd become. The first torpedo hit USS Oklahoma at 7:50 a.m., then another, then another. Torpedoes punched through the battleship's hull below the waterline, flooding compartments faster than damage control could respond. Oklahoma began listing to port. Within 12 minutes, she'd capsized completely, trapping over 400 sailors inside. Some would be rescued when salvage crews cut through the hull days later. Most wouldn't. USS West Virginia took multiple torpedo hits and began settling into the harbour bottom. Her captain, Meredith Bennion, was struck by shrapnel and killed on the bridge, making him the highest-ranking American officer to die in the attack. The ship's damage control parties managed to counter-flood to prevent capsizing, but West Virginia settled to the bottom with her superstructure still above water. USS California took 2 torpedoes and began flooding. Damage control struggled to keep her afloat, but with watertight integrity compromised and power failing, California slowly sank over the next 3 days, settling onto the harbour bottom. USS Arizona suffered the most catastrophic damage. A high-level bomber scored a direct hit on her forward magazine at 8:06 a.m. The resulting explosion was visible across the harbour. The magazine detonated with such force that it lifted Arizona's forward section out of the water and broke her back. She sank in 9 minutes, taking 1,177 sailors and Marines with her. The explosion was so massive that debris rained down on Ford Island and nearby ships. Bodies and wreckage scattered across the water. USS Nevada, moored alone at the northern end of Battleship Row, managed to get underway during the attack. She was the only battleship to leave her moorings. Her crew cut the mooring lines, fired up boilers, and headed for the harbour entrance, trying to escape to open water. It was a bold move that immediately attracted every Japanese pilot in the area. They swarmed Nevada like sharks sensing blood, determined to sink her in the narrow entrance channel and block the entire harbour. Nevada took multiple hits but kept moving. Her captain beached her near Hospital Point to avoid blocking the channel. She settled in shallow water, heavily damaged but not sunk. Her crew's seamanship and determination saved the harbour from being completely blocked. Meanwhile, the airfields were being systematically destroyed. Wheeler Field, Hickam Field, Bellows Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station. Japanese fighters and bombers hit them all. They strafed parked aircraft, bombed hangars, destroyed fuel storage, and shot up anything that moved. American pilots who tried to take off were usually shot down before they could gain altitude. A few fighters managed to get airborne and engage the attackers. Second Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor flew P-40s from Halewa Field and claimed multiple kills. They were exceptions. The second wave arrived at 8:40 a.m. 171 aircraft, including 54 high-level bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 36 fighters. Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led this wave. Their targets were ships that survived the first wave, remaining aircraft and shore installations. By this point, American anti-aircraft fire had intensified considerably. Surprise was gone. Crews were at battle stations, guns were manned and firing. The second wave hit harder resistance but still caused significant damage. They bombed dry docks, repair facilities, and oil storage tanks. They attacked the light cruiser Helena and the destroyer Shaw, both of which suffered severe damage. Shaw's forward magazine exploded in a massive fireball that became one of the iconic images of the attack. USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock at the time, took bomb hits, but remained operational. Destroyers Casson and Downs in the same dry dock were heavily damaged and eventually scrapped. The repair facilities at the Navy Yard took hits, but remained largely functional, which would prove crucial for recovery efforts. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. Japanese aircraft withdrew to their carriers. American defenders fired at everything in the sky, including some of their own aircraft trying to land. The confusion was total. Smoke covered the harbour. Fires burned on multiple ships. Rescue efforts were already underway, pulling survivors from burning oil-covered water. Nagumo had a decision to make. His strike force had achieved tactical surprise and devastating results, but Pearl Harbor still had fuel storage tanks, submarine pens, and repair facilities mostly intact. A third wave could destroy these critical infrastructure targets, crippling the base for months or even years. Commander Genda and others urged a third strike. Yamamoto's chief of staff later said not launching a third wave was Japan's biggest mistake of the war, but Nagumo refused. His orders were to hit and withdraw. American carriers weren't in port and were somewhere at sea. He'd lost 29 aircraft and didn't know where American retaliation might come from. The tactical victory was sufficient. He ordered the strike force to withdraw. It was a defensible decision based on available information, but it had massive strategic consequences. Those intact fuel tanks meant the Pacific Fleet could refuel without shipping oil from the mainland. Those intact repair facilities meant damaged ships could be salvaged and returned to service much faster than if they'd been destroyed. The submarine base remained operational, and American submarines would devastate Japanese shipping throughout the war. The final count was brutal. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 3 light cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers sunk or heavily damaged, 4 auxiliary vessels sunk, 188 aircraft destroyed, 159 damaged, 2,403 Americans killed, 1,178 wounded. Japanese losses, 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 men killed. In terms of exchange ratio, it was a devastating victory. In terms of strategic objectives, it was more complicated. The immediate aftermath at Pearl Harbor was chaos mixed with heroism. Sailors dove into burning oil-covered water to rescue shipmates. Damage control parties fought fires on sinking ships. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat hundreds of wounded. The harbor itself was a nightmarish landscape. Arizona burned for 2 days. Oklahoma lay capsized, her hull above water like a beached whale. Rescue crews could hear tapping from sailors trapped inside, frantically cutting through steel to reach survivors. They saved some. Time ran out for others. Utah, an older battleship converted to a target ship, had also capsized. Every ship in the harbor bore some mark of the attack. The psychological impact was immediate. Americans woke up on December 7th believing they were at peace. By noon, they knew they were at war. President Roosevelt received word around 1:30 p.m. Washington time. He immediately began planning his response. The next day, December 8th, he addressed Congress and delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech lasted 6 minutes. Congress voted for war an hour later. The vote was nearly unanimous, 388 to 1 in the House, 82 to 0 in the Senate. The sole dissenting vote came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. She would be vilified for it. Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States 3 days later, turning what might have been a Pacific conflict into a truly global war. Hitler's decision to declare war on America was possibly his biggest strategic blunder. It gave Roosevelt exactly what he needed, a clear justification to fight in Europe as well as the Pacific. But that was strategic thinking for later. In the immediate aftermath, Pearl Harbor needed to assess damage and begin recovery. The Pacific Fleet had suffered a devastating blow, but it wasn't dead. 3 carriers had been at sea during the attack: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. These carriers would form the backbone of American naval resistance over the coming months. The battleships were a mixed picture. Arizona was a total loss, too damaged to salvage. Oklahoma capsized and would eventually be raised but never return to service. Utah remained capsized permanently. But the other 5 battleships would all be salvaged, refloated, and returned to service. California, West Virginia, and Nevada would fight again after extensive repairs. Maryland and Tennessee suffered only moderate damage and were back in action relatively quickly. The salvage effort was a monumental undertaking. Engineers had to pump water from flooded ships, patch torpedo holes, and somehow lift capsized battleships upright. They did it through sheer determination and engineering creativity. Oklahoma was raised using massive winches and calculations that seemed to defy possibility. California and West Virginia were pumped out and refloated. It took months, sometimes years, but they did it. The speed of recovery surprised even American planners. Within weeks, the Navy Yard was functioning normally. Within months, some ships were returning to service. The Japanese assumption that they'd knocked out Pearl Harbor for a year or more proved overly optimistic. American industrial capacity and determination exceeded Japan's estimates, and that was the ultimate strategic failure of Pearl Harbor. The attack achieved tactical surprise and inflicted heavy losses. but it failed to achieve its core objective, preventing American interference in Japan's southern expansion. The carriers survived, the submarines survived, the fuel tanks survived, the repair facilities survived, and most importantly, American resolve didn't just survive, it hardened. Yamamoto understood this better than anyone in the Japanese high command. He'd warned them before the attack that he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, American industrial power would overwhelm Japan. Pearl Harbor bought Japan time, but it also guaranteed that America would use that time to build an armada. The attack had one other effect that Japanese planners hadn't fully considered. It unified American public opinion like nothing else could have. Before December 7th, America was deeply divided about entering the war. Isolationists argued against involvement in foreign conflicts. Interventionists argued for supporting Britain and China. The debate was bitter and unresolved. Pearl Harbor ended that debate in approximately 90 minutes. Isolationism collapsed overnight. Pacifism became politically untenable. The attack wasn't on some distant military installation. It was on American soil, on American servicemen, on a Sunday morning when many were still in their bunks. The outrage was visceral and total. Japan had calculated that a devastating blow would demoralize America into negotiating a settlement. They'd fundamentally misread American psychology. The attack didn't create defeatism, it created fury. Recruiting stations across America saw lines around the block the next day. Men who'd opposed the war now demanded the chance to fight. Women volunteered for defense work. The nation mobilized with a speed and determination that shocked observers. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan was executing the rest of their operational plan. While Pearl Harbor dominated headlines, Japanese forces were attacking throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The same day as Pearl Harbor, they hit the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and British possessions across the region. It was a coordinated offensive designed to seize resource-rich territories while America was reeling. The Philippines took the brunt of it. General Douglas MacArthur commanded American and Filipino forces there. He'd received warning of the Pearl Harbor attack hours before Japanese aircraft appeared over Luzon. Despite this warning, his aircraft were caught on the ground, parked in neat rows just like at Pearl Harbor. Japanese bombers destroyed them methodically. The pattern repeated, surprise lost, but tactical incompetence preserved. Within days, Japanese troops landed on Luzon. MacArthur's forces fought but were overwhelmed by superior numbers and air support. MacArthur retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, establishing a defensive position that would hold for months but was ultimately doomed. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to escape to Australia, famously promising, "I shall return." His troops were left to surrender or die. Most chose surrender, which led to the Bataan Death March and years in brutal POW camps. Wake Island held out longer than anyone expected. A tiny atoll defended by a few hundred Marines and civilian contractors, it repelled the first Japanese invasion attempt, sinking 2 destroyers in the process. The Marines radioed back a defiant message that became legendary, though the actual wording was likely less profane than the legend suggests. They held for 15 days before overwhelming force compelled surrender. Guam fell in 3 days. Hong Kong held until Christmas. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress in the Far East, fell in February 1942 after Japanese forces advanced down the Malayan Peninsula and attacked from the landward side, which British planners had considered impossible. The speed of Japanese conquest was stunning. Within 6 months, they controlled territory from Burma to the Central Pacific. But they never achieved the knockout blow they needed. The American carriers that missed Pearl Harbor became the foundation of American resistance. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, along with Yorktown and Hornet, formed a striking force that could challenge Japanese control even while the battle fleet lay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet shortly after the attack. He arrived at Pearl Harbor to find a shattered fleet, demoralized crews, and a defensive mindset. His first move was to shift focus. The battleship era was over, carrier aviation was the future. The Japanese had proven that at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz would use the same weapon against them. The first American offensive action came sooner than anyone expected. On February 4th, 1942, Task Force 8 under Admiral William Halsey raided Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. The raids caused minimal damage but enormous psychological impact. America could strike back. The defensive crouch was ending. April 1942 brought the Doolittle raid. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet to bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The raid caused little physical damage, but it humiliated Japanese military leadership who had promised the home islands would never be threatened. It also forced Japan to keep fighters and resources in Japan for defense, rather than deploying them to forward areas. More importantly, the Doolittle raid convinced Japanese naval leadership that they needed to eliminate American carrier power permanently. Admiral Yamamoto proposed an operation to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle by attacking Midway Island. If Japanese forces seized Midway, American carriers would have to respond, and the combined fleet could destroy them in detail. The plan was complex, involving multiple task forces operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Classic Japanese naval doctrine: divide forces, create confusion, achieve surprise, destroy the enemy in detail. It had worked at Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto assumed it would work again. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American codebreakers had partially cracked Japanese naval codes. They couldn't read everything, but they could read enough. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor analysed intercepted messages and concluded that Japan was planning a major operation against a target designated AF. They believed AF was Midway. To confirm this, they executed a brilliant deception. Midway was ordered to broadcast an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese communications referenced AF having water problems. Confirmation. Achieved. Midway was the target. Nimitz now had something commanders rarely get: foreknowledge of enemy intentions. He knew where Japan would attack, roughly when, and with what forces. He immediately began positioning his carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The latter rushed out of dry dock after damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea weeks earlier. 3 carriers against 4 or possibly 5 Japanese carriers. The odds weren't great, but they were better than walking into an ambush blind. The Battle of Midway began on June 4, 1942. Japanese carriers launched strikes against Midway Island, expecting to suppress defences before the invasion force arrived. American aircraft from Midway counterattacked, achieving little but forcing Japanese carriers to keep their combat air patrol active and their flight decks busy recovering and rearming aircraft. Then American carrier aircraft arrived. Torpedo squadrons attacked first, flying slow, low, and straight into withering anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet was annihilated. 15 aircraft lost, only 1 pilot survived. Torpedo Squadron 6 and Squadron 3 suffered similar losses. The sacrifice seemed pointless. Their torpedoes were too slow, too unreliable. Most missed or failed to detonate, but the torpedo attacks had drawn Japanese fighters down to low altitude. When American dive bombers arrived minutes later, the sky above the Japanese carriers was relatively clear. The dive bombers rolled into their attacks almost unopposed. At 10:26 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise attacked the carrier Kaga. Bombs struck the flight deck, penetrating to the hangar where armed and fueled aircraft were waiting. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. Kaga was doomed. Simultaneously, bombers from Yorktown hit Akagi, Yamamoto's flagship. Again, bombs penetrated the flight deck and ignited aircraft being rearmed below. Fire spread uncontrollably. Akagi would burn for hours before being scuttled. Bombers from Enterprise also hit Soryu, starting fires that quickly spread. 3 Japanese carriers burning or sinking in the span of 5 minutes. The turning point of the Pacific War compressed into a single tactical moment. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was undamaged and immediately launched counterattacks. Her aircraft found and hit Yorktown, crippling the American carrier. Yorktown would be abandoned, later torpedoed by a Japanese submarine, and finally sink. But Hiryu's location was now known, and Enterprise sent dive bombers that caught her the same way the others had been caught. Flight deck crowded with armed aircraft. Hiryu burned and later sank. Japan lost 4 carriers at Midway. America lost 1. More importantly, Japan lost hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew that couldn't be easily replaced. American pilot training programs were already ramping up to produce thousands of aviators. Japanese training capacity couldn't match that pace. The attrition math would only get worse. Midway proved that Pearl Harbor hadn't achieved its strategic objective. The American carriers Japan failed to sink in December destroyed Japan's carrier striking power in June. The 6-month window Yamamoto predicted had closed. American industrial production was accelerating. New carriers were being launched, new aircraft rolling off assembly lines. The war was entering its industrial phase, and Japan couldn't win an industrial war against America. But the war was far from over. Japan still controlled vast territories. Their army was largely intact. Their defensive positions across the Pacific were formidable. Defeating them would require years of brutal island-hopping campaigns, each one a miniature war of attrition. The first major American offensive began at Guadalcanal in August 1942. Marines landed to seize a partially constructed Japanese airfield. What was supposed to be a quick operation turned into a 6-month battle, involving multiple naval engagements, desperate land combat, and logistics challenges that nearly broke American resolve. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were particularly brutal. Night surface actions where ships fought at point-blank range. The waters north of the island became known as Iron Bottom Sound, from all the ships sunk there. American and Japanese cruisers, destroyers, and cargo vessels littering the ocean floor. The Navy lost more ships around Guadalcanal than at Pearl Harbor, but this time they stayed in the fight and eventually prevailed. Guadalcanal established the pattern for the Pacific War. Each island fortress required naval superiority, air superiority, amphibious assault, and grinding infantry combat. Each victory cost blood and material. But each victory also pushed American forces closer to Japan. The island-hopping campaign proceeded methodically. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each name became synonymous with heroism and horror. Marines assaulted fortified beaches against murderous fire. Soldiers fought through jungle and cave systems. The Japanese doctrine of fighting to the last man meant every island became a battle of annihilation. Tarawa was particularly brutal. In November 1943, Marines assaulted Betio Island, a tiny coral atoll defended by 4,500 Japanese troops who'd spent months fortifying every inch. The amphibious tractors couldn't clear the reef, leaving Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water while machine guns raked them. Nearly 1,000 Marines died in 76 hours of combat. The entire Japanese garrison fought to the death. Only 17 soldiers survived to be captured, and most of those were labourers, not combat troops. The air war paralleled the ground campaign. American pilots gradually established air superiority through superior training, better logistics, and most importantly, numbers. Japan couldn't replace losses fast enough. Every experienced pilot killed was replaced by a novice with minimal training. American pilots got better, Japanese pilots got worse. The quality gap widened into a chasm. Meanwhile, American submarines were systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping. Japan was an island nation dependent on imports for resources. Their empire existed to secure oil, rubber, steel, and food. American submarines cut those supply lines with ruthless efficiency. By 1944, Japan's maritime commerce was collapsing. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies never reached Japan. Freighters bringing resources from Southeast Asia were torpedoed. The empire was starving itself. Back at Pearl Harbor, the salvage and reconstruction effort continued throughout the war. The damaged battleships were raised, repaired, and returned to service one by one. By 1944, California, West Virginia, Maryland, Tennessee, Nevada, and Pennsylvania were all back in action, providing shore bombardment support for amphibious operations. They would never engage Japanese battleships in the climactic surface action naval planners had long envisioned, but they provided crucial fire support that saved countless lives during beach assaults. Arizona remained where she sank, a tomb for 1,177 sailors and Marines. Oklahoma was razed but never repaired, eventually sold for scrap and lost in a storm while being towed to the mainland. Utah remained capsized, a permanent memorial. The harbour itself transformed during the war. It became one of the largest naval bases in the world, a logistics hub supporting operations across the Pacific. Dry docks worked around the clock. Repair facilities handled thousands of ships. Supply depots stored mountains of ammunition, fuel and equipment. The base that Japan tried to eliminate became the linchpin of American victory. By 1945, American forces were approaching Japan itself. The capture of Iwo Jima and Okinawa put American aircraft within striking distance of the home islands. B-29 bombers began systematic firebombing of Japanese cities. The blockade tightened. Invasion plans were drafted for Operation Downfall, the assault on the Japanese mainland, with expected casualties measured in hundreds of thousands. Then, in early August 1945, 2 atomic bombs ended the discussion. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. The destructive power was beyond anything conventional warfare had produced. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war that began with a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor ended with weapons that made the concept of surprise attacks obsolete. On September 2, 1945, representatives of the Japanese government boarded the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, and signed the Instrument of Surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided, flanked by representatives from all the Allied powers. It was symbolic that the ceremony occurred on a battleship, the type of vessel Japan had tried to eliminate at Pearl Harbor, anchored in the enemy capital, representing total defeat. The Missouri herself was significant. She was one of the Iowa-class battleships built during the war, representing the peak of battleship design. She hadn't existed when Pearl Harbor was attacked. The fact that she was hosting the surrender ceremony drove home how completely the strategic situation had reversed. The aftermath of Pearl Harbor reshaped not just the war, but the entire post-war world. Japan was occupied and reformed. Democracy was imposed. The military disbanded. Article 9 of the new constitution renounced war. The nation that attacked Pearl Harbor became one of America's closest allies. America emerged as the dominant global superpower. The industrial base that overwhelmed Japan outproduced everyone else. Isolationism never returned. America became permanently engaged in international affairs. The Navy learned hard lessons from Pearl Harbor. Carriers replaced battleships as capital ships. Naval aviation became dominant. Intelligence and code-breaking proved their value. Every aspect of naval warfare was re-examined and reformed. The concept of surprise attack was transformed. Pearl Harbor demonstrated that modern militaries could strike before war was declared. This shaped Cold War thinking. Deterrence became the strategy. Maintain forces capable of surviving a first strike. Pearl Harbor's lesson was clear. Never again would America be caught unprepared. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Pearl Harbor was psychological. December the 7th, 1941 became shorthand for treachery, for surprise attack, for the moment when peace ended and war began. Remember Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry that united a divided nation and sustained morale through years of brutal warfare. Memorials were built. Survivors formed associations. Historians wrote thousands of books. Conspiracy theories suggesting Roosevelt knew in advance have been thoroughly debunked. The truth is simpler. Intelligence failures occurred without malice. Communication was poor, analysis flawed, assumptions wrong. The lessons from these failures transformed American intelligence services. The Office of Strategic Services, formed during the war, evolved into the CIA. Signals intelligence became a permanent priority. Interagency cooperation improved. The intelligence community expanded dramatically during the Cold War, shaped by determination to never suffer another Pearl Harbor. For Japan, Pearl Harbor became a symbol of strategic miscalculation. The attack achieved tactical surprise but strategic disaster. It brought America into the war with fury, guaranteed a fight to the finish, and ultimately led to atomic bombing and unconditional surrender. Japanese historians have spent decades analysing what went wrong, how the militarists led the nation into catastrophic war, and how to prevent it from happening again. Admiral Yamamoto didn't live to see Japan's defeat. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted messages detailing his inspection tour of bases in the Solomon Islands. Fighters were dispatched to intercept his aircraft. They found him exactly where intelligence predicted and shot down his plane over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor died in the jungle, killed by the intelligence capabilities his attack had spurred America to develop. Commander Fuchida, who led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, survived the war and became a Christian missionary. He traveled to America, preaching reconciliation and forgiveness. His transformation from warrior to pacifist reflected Japan's post-war journey. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the commanders in Hawaii, who bore responsibility for Pearl Harbor's unpreparedness, were relieved of command immediately. They spent the rest of their lives arguing that they'd been made scapegoats for failures higher up the chain. Multiple investigations found fault at various levels, but couldn't definitively assign blame. The question of whether they deserved their fate remains debated. The physical site of Pearl Harbor became a national memorial. The USS Arizona Memorial was dedicated in 1962, built directly over the sunken battleship. Oil still leaks from Arizona's fuel tanks, rising to the surface in tiny droplets that sailors call the tears of the Arizona. More than 2 million people visit the memorial each year, standing over the ship where 1,177 men died. Survivors of the attack hold reunions, though their numbers dwindle each year. They share memories of that Sunday morning. The explosions, the chaos, the heroism, the losses. They speak to school groups and historians, preserving first-hand accounts before they're gone forever. By 2025, only a handful remain, all over 100 years old. The lessons from these failures transformed American intelligence. The Office of Strategic Services evolved into the CIA. Signals intelligence became permanent. Interagency cooperation improved. The intelligence community expanded, shaped by determination to never suffer another Pearl Harbor. For Japan, Pearl Harbor became a symbol of strategic miscalculation. Tactical surprise but strategic disaster. It brought America into the war with fury and guaranteed unconditional surrender. Japanese historians spent decades analyzing the militarist miscalculations. Admiral Yamamoto didn't live to see Japan's defeat. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted messages detailing his inspection tour. Fighters were dispatched. They found him exactly where intelligence predicted and shot him down over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor died in the jungle, killed by the very intelligence capabilities his attack had spurred. Commander Fuchida, who led the air attack, survived and became a Christian missionary. He traveled to America preaching reconciliation. His transformation reflected Japan's post-war journey. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, who bore responsibility for unpreparedness, were relieved immediately. They spent their lives arguing they'd been scapegoats. Multiple investigations found fault at various levels but couldn't definitively assign blame. The physical site became a national memorial. The USS Arizona Memorial was dedicated in 1962, built over the sunken battleship. Oil still leaks from Arizona's tanks, rising in droplets sailors call the tears of the Arizona. 2 million people visit annually. Survivors hold reunions, though numbers dwindle. They share memories of that morning. Explosions, chaos, heroism, losses. They speak to groups, preserving first-hand accounts. By 2025, only a handful remain, all over 100. December 7th, 1941 changed everything. It ended American isolationism permanently. It unified a divided nation. It demonstrated that oceans weren't shields anymore, that distance didn't guarantee security, that modern war could arrive without warning. The strategic calculus that led Japan to attack Pearl Harbor was based on miscalculation. They believed they could knock out American naval power and negotiate a favorable settlement before industrial mobilization overwhelmed them. They were wrong on both counts. American carriers survived. American resolve hardened. Industrial capacity exceeded even optimistic Japanese estimates. But the attack did achieve one thing Japanese planners hadn't intended. It created the modern American military-industrial complex. Before Pearl Harbor, America maintained a relatively small peacetime military. After Pearl Harbor, that changed permanently. Defense spending became a permanent feature of the economy. Military readiness became a constant priority. Overseas bases proliferated. The military never fully demobilized after the war ended. This had profound implications for the post-war world. America became the guarantor of global security, at least from the Western perspective. NATO, bilateral defense treaties, forward-deployed forces, all of these grew from the determination to prevent another surprise attack. Pearl Harbor taught that waiting until war began was too late. Deterrence required constant readiness. The Cold War elevated this to an art form. Strategic Air Command kept bombers in the air 24 hours a day, ready to retaliate against Soviet nuclear attack. Ballistic missile submarines prowled the oceans with enough firepower to destroy civilization. Early warning systems scanned the skies constantly. The entire architecture of nuclear deterrence was built on one principle: never again would America be caught like it was at Pearl Harbor. Of course, the irony is that Pearl Harbor itself benefited from this readiness. The base that was attacked in 1941 became one of the most heavily defended locations on Earth. Today, Pearl Harbor is home to multiple military installations: the Naval Station, Joint Base, Pearl Harbor Hickam, submarine facilities, and the Pacific headquarters for multiple commands. Radar covers the approaches, air defenses protect the airspace, intelligence assets monitor potential threats across the entire Pacific. A surprise attack on Pearl Harbor today would be essentially impossible. The surveillance and defensive systems are too comprehensive. The lessons of 1941 have been encoded into every aspect of military planning and infrastructure. Whether this constant state of readiness is sustainable or even desirable is a separate question, but there's no doubt it exists. The cultural impact of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military policy. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became etched into American consciousness. It appeared on recruitment posters, war bonds, propaganda materials. It justified the internment of Japanese Americans, one of the darker episodes of the war. The need for security and the fear of fifth columnists led to one of the greatest civil liberties violations in American history, with over 120,000 people imprisoned based solely on their ancestry. The internment decision was driven by fear, racism, and Pearl Harbor paranoia. The logic was that if Japan could launch a surprise attack on Hawaii, they might have agents or sympathizers ready to sabotage the mainland. No evidence supported this. Japanese Americans were overwhelmingly loyal. Many served in the military with distinction, particularly the 402nd Regimental Combat Team, which became the most decorated unit in US military history. The internment was challenged in court and ultimately upheld by the Supreme Court in Korematsu v. United States, a decision that stands as one of the worst in the court's history. It wasn't until 1988 that the US government officially apologized and provided reparations to survivors. Pearl Harbor had created a climate of fear that justified the unjustifiable. Post-war, Pearl Harbor became a touchstone for surprise attacks and intelligence failures. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, commentators called it a technological Pearl Harbor. When terrorists attacked on September 11, 2001, the immediate comparison was to Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack on American soil that killed thousands and changed everything. The parallels weren't perfect, but the emotional resonance was clear. 9/11 produced reactions eerily similar to Pearl Harbor: national unity, calls for vengeance, massive military mobilization, expansion of intelligence services, curtailment of civil liberties in the name of security, the Patriot Act, warrantless surveillance, enhanced interrogation, all justified by the need to prevent another surprise attack. Pearl Harbor provided the template. The difference is that Pearl Harbor was a conventional military attack by a nation-state. The response could be directed at a specific enemy with clear military objectives. 9/11 was a terrorist attack by a non-state actor. The resulting war on terror had no clear endpoint, no obvious victory conditions, no formal surrender ceremony. Pearl Harbor led to World War II, which ended definitively. 9/11 led to conflicts that continued decades later. But the psychological mechanism was the same: shock, anger, determination to ensure it never happens again. Pearl Harbor created a template for how America responds to surprise attacks. The template doesn't always fit the circumstances, but it remains powerful. In military circles, Pearl Harbor is studied as a case study in multiple disciplines. Intelligence analysis uses it as an example of how pieces of information can be available without being properly assembled. Strategic planning examines how tactical success can mask strategic failure. Leadership courses analyze how commanders responded under pressure and how accountability was assigned. The attack itself is dissected in minute detail. What if the third wave had launched? What if the carriers had been in port? What if the fuel tanks had been destroyed? What if American radar operators had been believed? These counterfactuals illuminate how history turns on small decisions and chance occurrences. The Japanese perspective is equally instructive. What if Nagumo had known about American code breaking? What if they'd allocated resources differently, prioritizing infrastructure over battleships? What if they'd recognized that America's industrial capacity made a long war unwinnable? The strategic errors seem obvious in retrospect, but they were made by experienced professionals working with imperfect information under pressure. This is perhaps the most important lesson. Even smart, experienced, well-intentioned people can make catastrophic decisions. The Japanese military leadership wasn't stupid or suicidal. They made calculated gambles based on their understanding of the strategic situation. They were wrong, but their logic was comprehensible. Understanding how they went wrong helps prevent similar failures. On the American side, the failures were equally understandable. Intelligence had indicators of Japanese intentions but couldn't specify timing or targets. Commanders in Hawaii focused on sabotage prevention, because that seemed like the most immediate threat. Assumptions about Japanese operational capabilities were based on conventional wisdom that proved incorrect. Nobody wanted to believe that carriers could cross the Pacific undetected and launch a devastating surprise attack because it seemed tactically implausible. The fundamental problem was imagination failure. American planners couldn't imagine that Japan would do something so operationally risky. Japanese planners couldn't imagine that America would respond with such fury and determination. Both sides imagined the other would behave according to their own cultural logic and strategic assumptions. Both were wrong. This pattern repeats throughout history. Powers assess threats based on their own frameworks and miss what seems obvious in hindsight. The French built the Maginot Line because they couldn't imagine Germany would attack through Belgium again. The Soviets ignored intelligence about Operation Barbarossa because they couldn't imagine Germany would attack while still fighting Britain. American policymakers in 2001 focused on state actors and conventional threats, while terrorists trained to fly planes into buildings. Pearl Harbor stands as a stark reminder that the unthinkable happens, that distance and geography don't guarantee security, that tactical brilliance doesn't ensure strategic success, that assumptions about enemy behavior are often wrong, that surprise attacks can change everything in moments. For the individual sailors, soldiers, and Marines at Pearl Harbor that morning, these strategic considerations meant nothing. They experienced sudden violence, saw friends die, fought fires, rescued shipmates, and tried to make sense of chaos. Their stories are what give Pearl Harbor its human dimension beyond the strategic analysis. There are countless individual accounts. The sailors trapped in capsized ships, tapping on hulls, waiting for rescue that came too late. The pilots who managed to get airborne and engage attackers despite overwhelming odds. The damage control parties who fought hopeless fires. The medics who worked until they collapsed. The civilians who rushed to help without thought for their own safety. One particularly poignant account comes from the USS Arizona. When the forward magazine exploded, sailors in the aft sections had no chance to escape. The ship sank in minutes. Some men jumped overboard and swam through burning oil. Others were trapped below decks. The lucky ones died instantly. The unlucky ones had time to understand what was happening. Seaman First Class James Corey survived the explosion in Arizona's aft section. He later described the scene. Explosions, smoke so thick he couldn't see, water rushing in, men screaming. He made it topside and jumped overboard. Swimming through oil-covered water while debris rained down, he reached Ford Island. He turned back and saw Arizona settling into the harbor, her superstructure collapsing, fires raging. Most of his shipmates were still aboard. Another survivor, Donald Stratton, was severely burned when aviation fuel ignited on Arizona's deck. He was trapped on the burning ship until sailors on the repair ship Vestal threw him a line. He pulled himself hand over hand across the gap between ships, his burned hands leaving skin on the rope, while explosions continued around him. He survived to tell the story, but carried the scars physically and mentally for the rest of his life. The Oklahoma's sinking was particularly tragic. The battleship capsized so quickly that hundreds of sailors were trapped in compartments that were now upside down in the harbour bottom. Some of these compartments had air pockets. Men survived for hours or even days hoping for rescue. Salvage crews worked frantically, cutting through the hull wherever they heard tapping. They saved 32 men this way. The tapping from other compartments eventually stopped. Julio de Castro, a sailor from Oklahoma, was in one of the compartments that was reached. He described absolute darkness, water slowly rising, the smell of oil, the sound of men praying and crying. When rescuers finally cut through the hull and light poured in, he said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Others in different compartments weren't so fortunate. Their bodies were recovered when the ship was finally raised and righted. These individual experiences illustrate what strategic analysis often misses. War is fundamentally about human beings experiencing violence, terror, loss, and occasionally heroism. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a strategic setback or an intelligence failure. It was thousands of individual human tragedies, each one unique, each one devastating to families and communities. The hometown newspapers across America published casualty lists in the days after the attack. Small towns mourned sailors they'd known since childhood. Families received telegrams informing them their sons, husbands, or fathers were killed or missing. The abstract strategic reality of 403 dead translated into thousands of specific individual losses that rippled through communities nationwide. The same pattern occurred in Japan, though with less immediate impact because the casualties were lighter. 29 pilots and aircrew didn't return. 9 submariners died in midget submarine attacks that achieved nothing. Families in Japan mourned their losses just as American families did, though their grief had to be contained within the narrative of glorious sacrifice for the emperor. As the war progressed, and Japanese casualties mounted into the millions, these early losses from Pearl Harbor became footnotes. But for the families involved, they were everything. A son who trained as a pilot for years died in the attack and was buried at sea or cremated in a ceremony his parents never witnessed. The war took him and gave back only a notification and a posthumous promotion. The American response to the families of Pearl Harbor casualties established patterns that continued throughout the war. The Navy designated next of kin. They sent personal effects home when possible. They provided pensions and benefits. Gold Star families, those who'd lost someone in service, displayed flags with gold stars. Pearl Harbor created the first wave, and millions more joined them before the war ended. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Many suffered PTSD, though it wasn't called that then. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivor's guilt. These were common. Some never talked about the attack. Others talked about nothing else. The bond between survivors was unique. Reunion associations formed after the war. Annual gatherings at Pearl Harbor allowed them to pay respects and connect with others who understood. Educational efforts became central. They visited schools, spoke at ceremonies, participated in documentaries. Some survivors were natural speakers, others struggled but felt obligated. The stories shared common themes: sudden attack, courage under fire, horror of sinking ships, determination to survive. These narratives shaped how Americans understood Pearl Harbor. But survivor accounts also revealed uncomfortable truths. Not everyone behaved heroically. Some panicked. War isn't Hollywood. It's chaos where frightened people make split-second decisions and live with the consequences. As survivors passed away, their accounts became precious. Historians recorded oral histories before time ran out. These preserve voices and perspectives that documents can't capture. The last living survivor of the USS Arizona, Lou Conter, passed his 100th birthday years ago. He was among the final handful who could say, "I was there." His death, whenever it comes, will close a chapter. After that, Pearl Harbor exists only in recorded memory, documents, and artifacts. The living link to the event will be severed. This transition from lived experience to historical event is inevitable. World War I veterans all died decades ago. Pearl Harbor is following the same trajectory. Soon, it will be entirely history, no longer memory. What remains? The physical site, the memorials, the archives, the cultural memory in films and books. Pearl Harbor will endure as historical event and cultural touchstone, but the human connection will fade. This makes the present moment important. While survivors remain, they bridge past and present. Their presence reminds us that history is human experience. Within a few years, that connection will exist only in recordings. The question becomes, how do we remember Pearl Harbor when no one who was there can testify? How do we keep it relevant to generations who have no personal connection? How do we prevent it from becoming just another date in a textbook? Part of the answer lies in the physical site itself. As long as the USS Arizona Memorial exists, as long as visitors can stand over the sunken battleship and see oil still rising from her tanks, Pearl Harbor remains tangible. You can't visit Thermopylae or Waterloo and see the actual battle. You can visit Pearl Harbor and stand where men died. The memorial makes history physical. Oil leaking from Arizona creates a visceral connection. You're not reading about an attack that happened 80 plus years ago. You're standing above a ship that was sunk 80 plus years ago and is still there, still leaking oil, still holding the remains of men who never got off. This physical presence matters enormously for historical memory. It's why Civil War battlefield preservation is important, why concentration camps are maintained as memorials, why historic sites are protected. The physical ground where events occurred provides connection that documents alone can't match. But physical sites require context. Without explanation, Pearl Harbor is just a harbor with a memorial. The context comes from museums, educational programs, and historical interpretation. The Arizona Memorial is paired with museums that explain what happened, why it happened, and what it meant. The combination of physical site and historical context creates powerful learning experiences. The challenge is making this relevant to people whose lives have no obvious connection to World War II or the Pacific. Why should someone in 2025 care about an attack that happened in 1941? What does Pearl Harbor mean to someone whose grandparents weren't born when it occurred? One answer is that Pearl Harbor illuminates how nations blunder into wars they can't afford, how intelligence failures occur, how surprise attacks work, and how militaries adapt or fail to adapt. These lessons remain relevant regardless of temporal distance. The specifics change, but the patterns persist. The question becomes, how do we remember Pearl Harbor when no one who was there can testify? How do we keep it relevant to generations with no personal connection? How do we prevent it from becoming just another date in a textbook? Part of the answer lies in the physical site itself. As long as the USS Arizona Memorial exists, as long as visitors can stand over the sunken battleship and see oil still rising, Pearl Harbor remains tangible. You can't visit ancient battlefields and see the actual battle. You can visit Pearl Harbor and stand where men died. The memorial makes history physical. Oil leaking from Arizona creates visceral connection. You're not reading about an attack 80 plus years ago. You're standing above a ship that's still there, still leaking oil, still holding remains of men who never escaped. This physical presence matters enormously for historical memory. It's why Civil War battlefields are preserved, why concentration camps are maintained as memorials, why historic sites are protected. The physical ground where events occurred provides connection that documents alone can't match. But physical sites require context. Without explanation, Pearl Harbor is just a harbor with a memorial. The context comes from museums, educational programs, and historical interpretation. The Arizona Memorial is paired with museums that explain what happened, why it happened, and what it meant. The combination of physical site and historical context creates powerful learning experiences. The challenge is making this relevant to people whose lives have no obvious connection to World War II. Why should someone in 2025 care about an attack in 1941? What does Pearl Harbor mean to someone whose grandparents weren't born when it occurred? One answer is that Pearl Harbor illuminates how nations blunder into wars, how intelligence failures occur, how surprise attacks work, and how militaries adapt or fail to adapt. These lessons remain relevant regardless of temporal distance. The specifics change, but the patterns persist. Another answer is that Pearl Harbor represents a pivot point in American history. Before December 7, 1941, America could pretend to be isolated from global conflicts. After that date, Isolation was impossible. The attack didn't just start a war, it ended an era and began another. Understanding that transition helps explain the modern world. The third answer is simply that forgetting dishonours the dead. The 403 Americans who died at Pearl Harbor deserve remembrance not because their deaths were especially noble or meaningful, but because they were human beings whose lives were violently ended. Remembering them is an act of basic human decency. These three justifications, strategic lessons, historical understanding, and human decency, provide a framework for why Pearl Harbor matters beyond its immediate participants. But they require active effort to maintain. Historical memory doesn't preserve itself. It requires institutions, education, memorials, and cultural transmission. The National Park Service manages the USS Arizona Memorial and the associated historic sites at Pearl Harbor. This arrangement makes sense given the Park Service's mission to preserve historically significant locations, but it also creates some tension because Pearl Harbor remains an active military installation, not just a historical site. The contrast is stark. Visitors arrive by bus to the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center, pass through security screening that rivals airport security, and then tour memorials dedicated to remembrance and peace. Meanwhile, just across the harbor, the Navy operates one of its most important Pacific bases. Nuclear submarines dock at piers. Destroyers and cruisers come and go. Aircraft land and take off. The harbour that was attacked in 1941 is still very much a working military facility in 2025. This dual nature, memorial and military base, creates interesting dynamics. The military presence validates the memorial's significance. This wasn't some random attack on an abandoned base. It was and remains strategically important. But the military presence also competes for attention with the memorial mission. Tour boats full of civilians navigate the same waters as Navy vessels. The coexistence works because both the military and the Park Service benefit from it. The military gets a constant reminder of why readiness matters. The memorial gains authenticity from being at an active base rather than a museum piece. Visitors see both the past and the present, understanding that Pearl Harbor isn't just history, it's ongoing reality. But this arrangement also limits what visitors can see. Much of the harbour is off-limits to civilians. You can visit the Arizona Memorial, but you can't tour the entire attack site. You can see Battleship Row from certain vantage points, but you can't walk along Ford Island freely. The security requirements of an active military base constrain historical tourism. Some historians argue this is appropriate. Pearl Harbor is first and foremost a military installation. The memorial function is secondary. Allowing unrestricted tourist access would compromise security and interfere with military operations. The current balance, restricted but accessible tours, represents a reasonable compromise. Others contend that greater access would enhance historical understanding. Being able to walk along Battleship Row, see the exact locations where ships were moored, visit the airfields that were strafed, would create more powerful connections to history. The security restrictions, while understandable, limit educational opportunities. There's no perfect solution. Any compromise between operational security and historical access will leave some people dissatisfied. The current arrangement has evolved over decades and generally works, but it's constantly being re-evaluated as both military needs and tourist expectations change. The memorial itself, the white structure spanning the sunken Arizona, was designed by architect Alfred Prees and dedicated in 1962. The design is deliberately symbolic. The structure sags in the middle but rises at both ends, representing initial defeat, ultimate victory, and eternal honour. Whether visitors consciously recognise this symbolism is debatable, but the memorial has become iconic regardless. The memorial experience is carefully choreographed. Visitors watch a documentary film providing historical context. They board Navy boats that ferry them to the memorial. They enter the shrine room where marble walls list the names of those killed on Arizona. They look down through openings in the floor to see the ship below. The whole experience takes about 75 minutes and processes thousands of people daily. This mass tourism approach to solemn remembrance creates its own tensions. How do you maintain dignity and reverence while moving thousands of visitors through on a tight schedule? How do you ensure people understand the significance of what they're seeing, rather than just checking off a tourist attraction? The Park Service does its best through education and regulation. No swimsuits on the memorial, no food or drink, quiet voices, respectful behaviour. Rangers provide context and answer questions. The documentary film establishes appropriate tone before visitors board boats. Most people respond appropriately. Some don't, and dealing with disrespectful behaviour while maintaining decorum is an ongoing challenge. The memorial also faces physical challenges. It's a structure built in 1962, sitting in salt water, above a deteriorating shipwreck. Corrosion is constant. Maintenance is ongoing. The structure has been repaired and reinforced multiple times. At some point, the question becomes, how much can you repair before it's no longer the original memorial? The ship below presents even more complex challenges. Arizona is deteriorating. The steel hull is corroding. The structure is collapsing. At some point in the future, Arizona will no longer be recognizable as a ship. It will be a pile of rust on the harbor bottom. What happens to the memorial then? Engineers and historians debate this regularly. Some argue for preservation efforts to slow the deterioration. Others contend that natural decay is appropriate, that trying to freeze the ship in time is both impossible and symbolically wrong. The ship is dying. We should acknowledge that rather than fight it. The oil leaking from Arizona's fuel tanks presents its own dilemma. The oil creates powerful symbolism, but it's also pollution. At some point, the fuel will be exhausted, and the leaking will stop naturally. But should we hasten that by pumping out remaining fuel? Or is the environmental cost of leaking oil for another few decades acceptable, given the memorial significance? These aren't abstract questions. They require actual decisions about resource allocation, engineering interventions, and preservation philosophy. The National Park Service, Navy, and various advisory boards wrestle with them constantly. There are no easy answers. Beyond the Arizona Memorial, Pearl Harbor contains multiple other memorials and historic sites. The USS Utah Memorial commemorates the 58 men who died when Utah capsized. The memorial is less visited than Arizona's, partly because access is more restricted since Utah lies within the active base. But it serves the same function, honouring the dead and preserving memory. The USS Oklahoma Memorial, dedicated in 2007, honours the 429 sailors and Marines killed when Oklahoma capsized. The memorial uses marble pillars representing each victim, arranged to evoke the ship's formation. It's a powerful design that makes the individual losses tangible rather than abstract. The Battleship Missouri Memorial offers a different perspective. Missouri wasn't at Pearl Harbor during the attack. She was built during the war, but she hosted the surrender ceremony that ended it. Having Missouri permanently moored at Pearl Harbor creates symbolic bookends, the harbor where the war began in disaster and the ship where it ended in victory. Visitors can tour Missouri and see the actual deck where the surrender was signed. The surrender plaque marks the spot. Japanese and Allied flags from the ceremony are preserved. It's as close as you can get to touching history. The wood deck under your feet is the same wood where MacArthur stood, where Japanese representatives signed their nation's unconditional surrender. Missouri also represents the ultimate vindication of Pearl Harbor's survivors. The attack was supposed to cripple American naval power. Instead, America built more ships, trained more sailors, and ended the war with the most powerful navy in history. Missouri represents that triumph. She's a We Won memorial in contrast to Arizona's We Remember the Fallen memorial. The USS Bofin Submarine Museum adds another dimension. Bofin was a World War II submarine, one of the boats that strangled Japan's maritime commerce. She represents the offensive response to Pearl Harbor. Visitors can tour the submarine and experience the cramped conditions, the claustrophobic spaces, the primitive technology. It humanizes the war in ways that looking at ships from shore can't match. Together, these memorials create a comprehensive Pearl Harbor experience. Arizona for the attack, Oklahoma and Utah for additional losses, Missouri for victory, Bofin for the submarine war. The museums provide context. The visitor center ties it together. It's carefully designed to educate while honoring the dead. But there are gaps in the narrative. The memorials focus heavily on American experiences and losses. Japanese perspectives are largely absent. The attack is presented as unprovoked treachery rather than a desperate strategic gamble by a nation that felt cornered by economic sanctions. The broader context of Japanese expansion and American opposition gets simplified. This isn't necessarily wrong. Pearl Harbor is an American memorial at an American base commemorating an attack on American forces. Expecting balanced treatment of Japanese motivations might be asking too much. But it does mean visitors get a partial picture, which is fine as long as they understand it's partial. Some historians advocate for more comprehensive treatment of the Pacific War's origins. Why was Japan expanding? What drove their resource needs? How did American, British, and Dutch colonial possessions in Asia factor into Japanese calculations? What role did oil embargoes play in pushing Japan toward war? These questions deserve exploration. Others argue that such complexity dilutes the memorial's purpose. Pearl Harbor memorials exist to honor American dead and remember American sacrifice. Providing extensive Japanese historical context risks seeming like justification or excuse-making for an attack that killed thousands. Keep the memorials focused on remembrance, they argue, and leave complex historical analysis to academics. The compromise has been to provide some contextual information in museum exhibits, while keeping the memorials themselves focused on remembrance. This satisfies neither camp completely, but avoids the extremes of either oversimplification or excessive historicizing. International visitors, particularly Japanese tourists, navigate these memorials carefully. Many Japanese visitors report feeling conflicted. They want to understand this pivotal event in their nation's history, but doing so at memorials that emphasize Japanese aggression and American victimization creates discomfort. Some report feeling unwelcome despite staff efforts to be inclusive. The cultural differences in how nations remember wars complicate this further. American memorial culture tends toward explicit remembrance, names on walls, specific casualties counted, individuals honored. Japanese memorial culture often emphasizes collective sacrifice and avoids dwelling on specific deaths. These different approaches to memory can clash. Pearl Harbor has hosted Japanese officials on anniversary commemorations. In 2016, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited the Arizona Memorial, becoming the first sitting Japanese premier to do so. The visit was carefully choreographed to show respect without implying apology. Abe offered condolences but not apologies, a distinction that matters in diplomatic protocol. The visit sparked debate in both countries. Some Americans felt it was inappropriate for the leader of the nation that attacked Pearl Harbor to visit without apologizing. Some Japanese felt Abe was too deferential, that showing respect to American war dead implied Japanese aggression was wrong. Both reactions missed the point that reconciliation requires acknowledging pain without endless recrimination. Abe's visit was paired with President Obama's earlier visit to Hiroshima, creating symbolic balance. Obama visited the site of American atomic bombing without apologizing. Abe visited the site of Japanese attack without apologizing. Both leaders acknowledged suffering without accepting blame. This careful dance reflects how nations with violent pasts attempt reconciliation without undermining their own historical narratives. The 75th anniversary commemorate in 2020 brought renewed attention. Fewer than a dozen survivors remained alive. The ceremony acknowledged this was likely the last major anniversary with survivors present. COVID-19 affected the commemoration. Attendance was limited. Survivors stayed home given their vulnerability. History marches on even during pandemics. December 7th ceremonies occur annually. Survivors who are able attend. Veterans participate. Honor guards perform. The ritual maintains continuity, keeping Pearl Harbor in cultural consciousness. These ceremonies honor the dead, provide closure, educate younger generations, and remind military personnel why readiness matters. But they risk becoming rote when repeated yearly. The challenge is keeping them meaningful while maintaining tradition. The Park Service and military planners try to balance innovation with tradition. They incorporate new technology for virtual participation. They include diverse voices in speaking roles. They update educational materials to reflect current scholarship. They adapt presentation methods for younger audiences. But the core ceremony remains largely unchanged. Colours, anthems, speeches, wreath-laying, moment of silence, taps. The structure endures because it works, because change for its own sake risks alienating those who find comfort in tradition. Education programs extend beyond ceremonies. Schools bring students for trips. Teachers use Pearl Harbor as a case study. Filmmakers produce documentaries. Authors write books. The educational mission is continuous. The quality varies widely. Some materials are excellent, others prioritize entertainment over accuracy. The internet has democratized history, meaning anyone can produce content regardless of expertise. Conspiracy theories persist despite debunking. The most common, Roosevelt knew about the attack and let it happen. These theories are nonsense, contradicted by evidence, but they won't die. They persist because conspiracies are more exciting than bureaucratic incompetence. Drama sells. Historians keep debunking because accuracy matters even when it's less exciting than fiction. Popular culture's treatment varies. Some films attempted historical accuracy. Others prioritized romance and action. Both have value but serve different purposes. Torah, 1970, remains the gold standard. It was a joint American-Japanese production presenting both perspectives. Attack sequences were painstakingly recreated. Pearl Harbor, 2001, used the attack as backdrop for romance. Historical events were simplified. The attack sequence was spectacular but took liberties. Historians criticized it. Audiences made it a commercial success. These divergent receptions illustrate tension between historical accuracy and popular entertainment. Historians want faithful representation. General audiences want emotional engagement and entertainment. Producing work that satisfies both is difficult and rare. Most creators choose one priority or the other, accepting that you can't please everyone. Video games have tackled Pearl Harbor with mixed results. Flight simulators allow players to recreate the attack from the Japanese perspective, raising ethical questions about gamifying real tragedies. Museums have embraced interactive technology more carefully. Touchscreens, virtual reality, and augmented reality enhance learning when used thoughtfully. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans includes extensive Pearl Harbor exhibits. The museum's approach is comprehensive. Artifacts, oral histories, immersive experiences, scholarly interpretation. It demonstrates how museums can use technology to enhance rather than replace traditional exhibits. Physical objects retain primacy while technology provides context. Pearl Harbor's role in American civic religion is worth examining. The attack has become mythologized as a moment when Americans united against evil. December 7th represents lost innocence, the end of isolationism, the beginning of America's rise to superpower status. Like all myths, this narrative contains truth, but simplifies complex reality. The reality is messier. America wasn't innocent before Pearl Harbor. American imperialism had brought Hawaii under US control in the first place. American economic sanctions on Japan were deliberate provocations. American support for China and Britain put the US on a collision course with Japan. Pearl Harbor didn't create American involvement in global conflicts. It made that involvement undeniable. The unity narrative is also simplified. America did unite after Pearl Harbor, but not everyone or equally. Japanese Americans were imprisoned despite overwhelming loyalty to the United States. Some Native Americans questioned fighting for a government that had systematically oppressed them for generations. Some African Americans asked why they should fight fascism abroad while facing Jim Crow discrimination at home. Unity existed, but it was neither total nor uncomplicated or without significant moral blind spots. Yet despite these complications, Pearl Harbor did forge genuine national unity on some level. The shock was real. The anger was real. The determination to respond was real. Millions of Americans volunteered for military service who weren't drafted. Millions more worked in defense industries, bought war bonds, accepted rationing, and made genuine sacrifices. The myth of unity isn't entirely false, it's just incomplete. This pattern of mythologizing while simplifying repeats throughout American military history. Valley Forge becomes about noble suffering rather than incompetent logistics. D-Day becomes about heroism rather than calculated risk with acceptable casualties. Vietnam becomes about either noble cause betrayed or pointless imperial adventure, depending on political perspective. Every conflict gets simplified into narratives that serve present needs rather than historical complexity. Pearl Harbor fits this pattern perfectly. It's remembered as unprovoked treachery that awakened a sleeping giant. That's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete. Japan's motivations, America's economic warfare, the geopolitical context of empire and colonialism, all of this gets backgrounded in favour of simpler narratives about good versus evil. The danger isn't that these simplified narratives exist. People need accessible stories to understand history. The danger is when simplified narratives become the only narratives, when complexity is rejected as unpatriotic or overly academic. Pearl Harbor can be both an unprovoked attack and the predictable outcome of escalating tensions. Both truths coexist. Academic historians have produced sophisticated analyses of Pearl Harbor that acknowledge this complexity. They examine Japanese strategic calculations, American economic pressure, intelligence failures on both sides, and the broader context of imperial competition in the Pacific. This scholarship is valuable and necessary. It's also largely inaccessible to general audiences who aren't reading academic journals. The gap between academic history and popular understanding creates problems. Public memory of Pearl Harbor is shaped by films, memorials, and annual ceremonies, not by scholarly articles. When academics critique popular narratives for oversimplification, they're often ignored because their critiques aren't communicated in accessible ways. Bridging this gap requires historians who can write for popular audiences without sacrificing accuracy. It requires documentary filmmakers who prioritize historical fidelity. It requires memorial designers who incorporate complexity into exhibits. It requires teachers who can convey nuance to students. All of this is difficult and often poorly funded. The National Park Service does reasonably well at this. Their exhibits at Pearl Harbor provide context without overwhelming visitors. They acknowledge Japanese perspectives without excusing the attack. They explain intelligence failures without conspiracy theories. They honor the dead while educating the living. It's a delicate balance, and they don't always succeed, but they try. Other institutions have been less successful. Some museums present Pearl Harbor as straightforward good versus evil narrative. Some documentary films prioritize dramatic reconstruction over accurate analysis. Some educational materials repeat outdated interpretations. The quality of public history varies wildly depending on who's producing it and what their priorities are. Commercial pressures complicate this further. Accurate historical analysis doesn't always make good television. Nuanced interpretation doesn't fit easily into museum audio tours. Complexity requires time and attention that busy tourists may not have. The imperative to entertain competes with the imperative to educate. The solution isn't to abandon popular history in favour of academic purity. It's to do popular history better, to find ways to be both accessible and accurate. Some historians excel at this. Others refuse to engage with popular audiences, viewing it as beneath them. Both approaches have consequences. When academics abandon popular history, they leave it to others who may prioritise entertainment over accuracy. When popular historians ignore academic scholarship, they perpetuate outdated interpretations. The ideal is collaboration, but institutional structures often make this difficult. Universities reward publishing in academic journals, not writing popular books. Museums hire educators, not researchers. The incentive structures work against bridging the gap. Pearl Harbor scholarship continues to evolve. New documents get declassified. New analytical frameworks emerge. Historians reassess old questions and ask new ones. The attack that occurred in 1941 is fixed in time, but our understanding of it continues to develop. Recent scholarship has focused on several areas. Intelligence analysis has received renewed attention, examining not just what information was available, but how organizations process and act on intelligence. The parallels to 9/11 are obvious and uncomfortable. Both attacks involved intelligence failures where pieces of information existed but weren't properly synthesized. The comparison illuminates how difficult intelligence work actually is. It's easy in retrospect to say, they should have known, but before an attack occurs, threat information competes with thousands of other signals. Distinguishing signal from noise is extraordinarily difficult. Both Pearl Harbor and 9/11 demonstrate how even competent intelligence professionals can miss indicators that seem obvious afterward. Another area of recent scholarship examines decision-making under uncertainty. Both American and Japanese leaders made choices based on incomplete information and faulty assumptions. Understanding how they reached their decisions, even wrong ones, helps explain how similar failures might occur in the future. Japanese decision-making has received particular attention. Western historians long portrayed Japanese leaders as either insane or suicidal to attack America. Recent scholarship has shown they were neither. They were rational actors making calculated gambles based on their understanding of strategic realities. They were wrong, but their logic was coherent given their assumptions. This matters because dismissing enemy decisions as irrational prevents learning from them. If Japanese leaders were simply crazy, there's nothing to learn. If they were rational actors making understandable mistakes, then examining those mistakes provides insights into how rational actors can still blunder into catastrophic wars. The domestic impact of Pearl Harbor has also received scholarly attention, particularly regarding Japanese-American internment. This was one of the darkest episodes of World War II from the American perspective, and understanding how fear and racism combined to produce such injustice remains relevant. The internment was justified at the time as military necessity. Pearl Harbor had shown that surprise attacks were possible. The reasoning went, so potential fifth columnists needed to be controlled. The fact that no evidence supported this reasoning, that Japanese Americans were overwhelmingly loyal, that the policy was driven by racism rather than legitimate security concerns, all of this was ignored or downplayed. It took decades for America to acknowledge this injustice. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 apologized and provided reparations to surviving internees. The acknowledgement was important, but it came too late for most internees to benefit. Many had died. All had suffered decades of stigma and loss. The lesson is that fear enables injustice. Pearl Harbor created fear of Japanese attack. That fear was weaponized against innocent people. Similar patterns have recurred throughout American history. Fear of communism led to McCarthyism. Fear of terrorism led to civil liberties violations after 9/11. Fear of immigration leads to various contemporary policies. The mechanism is the same. Fear plus prejudice equals injustice. Recognizing this pattern doesn't prevent it, unfortunately. Every generation seems to believe their fears are uniquely justified, that their prejudices are rational responses to real threats. Pearl Harbor's legacy includes this cautionary tale about how easily fear overwhelms justice. But the lesson has to be relearned constantly. The strategic legacy of Pearl Harbor is equally complex. The attack demonstrated that carrier aviation had superseded battleships as the dominant naval weapon. This was already becoming apparent, but Pearl Harbor made it undeniable. Navies worldwide shifted focus to carriers. The battleship era ended effectively on December 7, 1941. This transition had been underway before Pearl Harbor, but the attack accelerated it dramatically. Carrier tactics developed rapidly during the war. By 1945, the US Navy operated massive carrier task forces that could project power across thousands of miles. This capability shaped post-war naval strategy and continues to define naval power today. The concept of the surprise attack also evolved. Pearl Harbor showed that distance provided less security than previously thought. Oceans weren't barriers if attackers had sufficient range and determination. This reality shaped Cold War strategy, where the possibility of surprise nuclear attack drove decades of defense planning. The bomber gap, the missile gap, fears of Soviet first strikes, all of these anxieties descended from Pearl Harbor's lesson that America could be attacked without warning. Whether this lesson was correctly applied is debatable. The Soviet Union never launched a surprise attack on America. The feared nuclear Pearl Harbor never occurred, but the possibility shaped American policy profoundly. Some historians argue this constant readiness prevented attack. The deterrent worked, in other words. Others contend it led to wasteful military spending and unnecessary conflicts. Both interpretations have supporting evidence. The question ultimately becomes counterfactual. What would have happened if America had remained less prepared? We can't know, which makes definitive judgments impossible. What's clear is that Pearl Harbor created an American strategic culture focused on preventing surprise attacks. This culture persists into the present. Massive intelligence agencies, global surveillance systems, forward-deployed military forces, all of these reflect determination to never again be caught like December 7, 1941. Whether this strategic culture serves American interests well is contested. Critics argue it leads to excessive military spending, unnecessary wars, and erosion of civil liberties. Defenders argue it maintains peace through strength and prevents worse conflicts. the debate continues without resolution, a long-running argument about how to apply Pearl Harbor's lessons. The technological legacy is also significant. Pearl Harbor spurred military innovation across multiple domains. Radar development accelerated. Code breaking became a major priority. Aircraft design advanced rapidly. Naval tactics evolved. Amphibious warfare was perfected. The Manhattan Project, while not directly caused by Pearl Harbor, was enabled by the massive mobilization the attack triggered. Many of these innovations had dual-use applications. Radar led to civilian air traffic control. Computing advanced through code-breaking work. Jet engines developed for military aircraft enabled commercial aviation. Nuclear technology, despite its destructive origins, led to power generation. The war accelerated technological development in ways that shaped the post-war world. The economic legacy is equally profound. Pearl Harbor triggered massive industrial mobilization. Factories converted to war production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Unemployment, which had plagued the Depression, evaporated. The war economy finally ended the Great Depression in ways that New Deal programs hadn't fully achieved. This economic mobilization demonstrated American industrial capacity in ways that surprised both allies and enemies. The production numbers are staggering. By 1945, America was producing aircraft, ships, and weapons in quantities that dwarfed everyone else combined. This industrial power won the war and established American economic dominance afterward. The wartime economic boom created the foundation for post-war prosperity. The GI Bill educated millions of veterans. Defense spending continued at high levels during the Cold War. Military-industrial employment remained significant. The economy that Pearl Harbor mobilized never fully demobilized, creating what Eisenhower later called the military-industrial complex. Whether this was beneficial or harmful remains debated. The economy grew, living standards rose, America became the world's richest nation. But military spending absorbed resources that might have addressed domestic needs. Defense priorities shaped research and development. The opportunity costs were real, even if difficult to calculate precisely. The social legacy includes changes to gender roles, at least temporarily. Women worked in defense industries in numbers previously unthinkable. Rosie the Riveter became iconic. Women proved they could do men's work when given the opportunity. This didn't immediately lead to lasting equality, but it created precedents and experiences that later feminist movements built upon. The war also began changing racial dynamics, though progress was slow and contested. African Americans served in segregated units, but demonstrated their capabilities. The contradiction between fighting fascism abroad while maintaining discrimination at home became increasingly difficult to justify. Pearl Harbor didn't cause the civil rights movement, but it created conditions that made that movement more possible. For Japanese Americans, the social legacy was complicated and painful. Internment destroyed communities and lives, but after the war, surviving Japanese Americans rebuilt with remarkable resilience. They emphasized education, economic success, and integration. The community that had been imprisoned became one of America's most successful ethnic groups by various metrics. This success created its own problems. The model minority myth suggested that other minority groups could succeed through hard work alone, ignoring structural barriers and historical injustices. It also obscured the ongoing effects of internment on Japanese American families and communities. Success doesn't erase trauma or injustice. The diplomatic legacy shaped post-war relations across the Pacific. The US-Japan alliance, forged in occupation and sustained through the Cold War, became one of the most important bilateral relationships in American foreign policy. The nation that attacked Pearl Harbor became one of America's closest allies and trading partners. This transformation required both nations to navigate complicated memories. Japan had to accept defeat and reform. America had to move beyond viewing Japan as an enemy. The process wasn't always smooth, but it succeeded remarkably well. The alliance endures despite occasional tensions over base locations, cost-sharing, and historical memory. Part of what made reconciliation possible was mutual interest. Both nations benefited during the Cold War. Japan got security guarantees and economic access. America got a key Pacific ally and bases. The arrangement worked for both sides, but reconciliation also required acknowledging history without being paralyzed by it. Japanese leaders accepted responsibility without being defined by wartime behavior. American leaders remembered Pearl Harbor without letting it poison the relationship. The contrast with some other post-war relationships is instructive and illuminating. Japan-Korea relations remain deeply strained by unresolved historical issues and competing narratives about wartime behavior. China-Japan relations are complicated by wartime memories and contemporary geopolitical competition. The US-Japan relationship succeeded partly because both sides chose to prioritize future cooperation over endless recrimination about past grievances. This doesn't mean forgetting Pearl Harbor or other significant wartime events and their human costs. It means remembering them in ways that inform present behavior without dictating it in perpetuity. The memorial at Pearl Harbor honors American dead without demanding eternal enmity toward Japan or perpetual hostility. Japanese acknowledgement of wartime aggression exists alongside friendship with former enemies. Both are possible simultaneously and can coexist peacefully. The generational aspect matters here. The generation that fought World War II has passed. Younger Japanese and Americans have no personal memory. For them, Pearl Harbor is history, not lived experience. Educational exchange programs serve this purpose. Japanese students visit Pearl Harbor. American students visit Hiroshima. Both learn about the war from different perspectives. The long-term trajectory demonstrates that former enemies can become partners. This pattern repeated with Germany and Italy. Historical conflicts don't have to define relationships forever. Pearl Harbor becomes not just memory of attack, but evidence that reconciliation is possible. The harbor hosts both memorials to American dead and visits from Japanese officials. The past is remembered but doesn't prevent moving forward. This serves as counterpoint to regions where historical grievances remain active barriers to cooperation and peace. The Balkans, the Middle East, and parts of Asia all suffer from inability to move past historical conflicts and forge new relationships. The US-Japan relationship demonstrates that genuine reconciliation is achievable when both sides commit to it with sustained effort and mutual goodwill over many years. But achieving reconciliation required specific conditions. Japan's total defeat meant accepting American terms. The Cold War gave both nations mutual interests. Economic interdependence created practical reasons for partnership. Other conflicts lack these conditions. When neither side wins decisively, when interests don't align, reconciliation becomes harder. Pearl Harbor's legacy includes both memory of attack and the model of reconciliation. The environmental legacy is often overlooked. The sunken ships contain fuel oil and ammunition, affecting the harbor's ecology. Arizona still leaks oil. Managing environmental issues while preserving historical sites creates ongoing challenges. The oil is both memorial symbol and pollution. It creates connection to the attack, but also contaminates the harbor. Environmental concerns might eventually override historical preservation. Other wrecks face similar dilemmas. Decisions about preservation involve balancing historical, environmental, and practical considerations. Climate change threatens Pearl Harbor's memorials. Sea level rise could impact the Arizona Memorial. Long-term preservation requires accounting for environmental changes that weren't factors when memorials were built. These environmental challenges are fundamentally different from other preservation issues. You can repair corroded steel or replace deteriorating concrete, but you can't stop environmental change. Adaptation becomes necessary for long-term preservation. The financial legacy is substantial. The attack cost thousands of lives and millions in destroyed equipment. The subsequent war cost trillions in current terms. Defense spending as a permanent feature traces directly to Pearl Harbor's impact. Modern military budgets dwarf pre-Pearl Harbor spending. Pearl Harbor created acceptance for permanent military readiness that shapes federal spending priorities. The direct costs of maintaining Pearl Harbor as memorial and military base require ongoing funding. Private fundraising supplements government spending for some activities. The tourism economy generated by Pearl Harbor is significant for Hawaii. Millions of visitors annually create jobs and economic activity. Hotels, restaurants, and tour operators all benefit. The economic impact extends far beyond the memorial itself. But tourism-driven development creates tensions. Should Pearl Harbor be primarily a solemn memorial or a tourist attraction? Can it be both effectively? How do you balance economic benefits with appropriate reverence for the dead? The interpretive challenges facing Pearl Harbor memorials will only increase with time. As personal memory fades and the attack recedes further into history, maintaining emotional connection becomes harder. Future generations will have no living link to the events. The attack will be as distant from them as the Spanish-American War is from people alive today. This doesn't mean Pearl Harbor will be forgotten, but the nature of remembrance will change significantly. It will become more abstract, more intellectual, less visceral and emotionally immediate. The shift from memory to history is inevitable and natural. Managing that transition while preserving meaningful engagement with the past is the central challenge facing Pearl Harbor's stewards going forward into an uncertain future. One version of Pearl Harbor's story is simple. Japan attacked without warning. America responded with fury. The war ended in total victory. This narrative is clean, satisfying, and incomplete. Another version acknowledges complexity. Economic warfare preceded military warfare. Intelligence failures occurred on both sides. Racist policies tarnished American conduct. Victory came at enormous cost. This narrative is messier but more accurate. Then there's the version focusing on individual experiences. Sailors trapped in capsized ships, families receiving telegrams, survivors struggling with trauma. This narrative resists simplification because human experience always does. All three versions are true. History contains multitudes. Pearl Harbor was strategic miscalculation and human tragedy and catalyst for transformation. Choosing one interpretation doesn't invalidate the others. This is perhaps the hardest lesson Pearl Harbor teaches. We want simple narratives with clear causes and obvious effects. But history offers complexity that resists easy categorization. The challenge is accepting that complexity while still drawing meaningful conclusions. Pearl Harbor transformed America in ways that continue echoing. The attack ended isolationism permanently. It demonstrated that surprise attacks were possible. It showed that oceans weren't protective barriers. The transformation extended beyond military policy. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. African Americans gained leverage to challenge discrimination. Japanese Americans suffered injustice that later generations had to acknowledge. The war reshaped American society in ways both progressive and regressive. The industrial mobilization transformed the economy. Government spending reached unimaginable levels. Industries converted to war production. Unemployment disappeared. The Depression ended through massive military spending rather than New Deal programs. The scientific advances accelerated during the war reshaped the modern world. Radar, jet engines, computers, nuclear technology all advanced dramatically. These innovations had civilian applications. Computing advances for code breaking became the foundation for modern information technology. But technological progress came with costs. Nuclear weapons created existential threats previous generations never faced. The possibility of human extinction through nuclear war was new to history. The Cold War was shaped fundamentally by Pearl Harbor's lessons. Both superpowers prepared for surprise attacks that never came. Nuclear arsenals grew based on deterrence logic. The strategy worked in that no nuclear war occurred, but it consumed resources on staggering scale. Pearl Harbor's lesson, that being unprepared invites attack, drove arms races. But that lesson might have been overlearned. Preparation for unlikely scenarios consumed resources that might have addressed actual problems. The intelligence failures transformed how America gathered information. The CIA, NSA, and other agencies represented institutional responses to the failure to predict the attack. These agencies prevented some threats but created others. Mass surveillance, covert operations, interference in foreign governments, all justified as necessary for security. Whether the benefits justified the costs remains debated. The parallels between Pearl Harbor and 9/11 extend beyond surprise attacks. Both triggered massive military mobilizations. Both led to wars lasting far longer than expected. Both created security apparatuses raising civil liberties concerns. The differences are equally significant. Pearl Harbor was conventional military attack by a nation-state. 9/11 was terrorism by non-state actors. Pearl Harbor led to total war with defined victory. 9/11 led to open-ended conflicts. but the emotional responses were remarkably similar: shock, anger, desire for retaliation, national unity, determination to prevent future attacks. Americans in 1941 and 2001 experienced similar emotional journeys despite vastly different contexts. The question becomes whether Pearl Harbor's lessons apply to contemporary threats. Climate change, cyber warfare, pandemics, these modern challenges don't fit Pearl Harbor's template. Applying lessons from 1941 to fundamentally different problems might do more harm than good. Yet some lessons remain relevant. Intelligence failures still occur. Organizations still struggle to synthesize information. Leaders still make decisions based on incomplete information. Human nature hasn't changed, even if threats have. Pearl Harbor also teaches about resilience. The harbor that was devastated rebuilt and became stronger. The ships that were sunk were raised or replaced. The nation that was attacked mobilized and won. Recovery was possible through determination. This lesson resonates across contexts. Communities hit by disasters rebuild. Economies recover. Individuals overcome trauma. Pearl Harbor demonstrates both how catastrophic unexpected events can be and how resilience can overcome them. The memorial function extends beyond honoring the specific individuals who died there. The 403 who died at Pearl Harbor stand for the 4 or 5 the 399 Americans who died in the entire war. This symbolic weight means Pearl Harbor carries burden beyond its specific events. It has to stand for the Pacific War, for American entry into World War II, for the generation that fought and won. But symbols work through concentration. By focusing on specific locations, we make abstract history tangible. The enormous scale of World War II becomes comprehensible through Pearl Harbor. This is why physical memorials matter. They provide location for remembrance where abstract history becomes tangible. Standing over Arizona's wreck creates connection to the past that reading about it can't match. As the generation that experienced World War II passes away, these physical memorials become more important. They're the remaining tangible connections to events that shaped the modern world. The challenge is ensuring these sites remain meaningful rather than becoming tourist attractions divorced from their significance. Disneyfication is a real risk. Balancing accessibility with reverence requires constant attention. Pearl Harbor has generally avoided the worst of this. The National Park Service maintains focus on education and remembrance. Commercial aspects exist but don't dominate. But maintaining this balance requires ongoing effort. The educational mission extends beyond the physical memorial. Pearl Harbor appears in history curricula. The quality of education varies depending on teachers and materials. Some students get sophisticated analysis, others get simplified narratives. Digital resources have expanded educational access. Virtual tours allow people who can't visit to experience it remotely. Online archives provide primary sources. Technology enables engagement with history in ways previous generations couldn't access. But digital access creates challenges. Information abundance makes distinguishing quality from garbage harder. Anyone can create Pearl Harbor content regardless of accuracy. Students encounter both excellent resources and complete nonsense. Media literacy becomes crucial. Teaching students to evaluate sources and think critically about historical claims is as important as teaching content itself. Pearl Harbor can serve as a case study for these skills. The military continues studying Pearl Harbor in multiple disciplines. Naval tactics, strategic planning, intelligence analysis, leadership under pressure all use Pearl Harbor as educational material. Military officers study what went wrong not to assign blame but to learn from mistakes. Civilian institutions can learn from this approach. Corporations study business failures. Medical institutions analyze errors. Any organization wanting to learn from mistakes rather than just assigning blame can apply similar frameworks. The international perspective on Pearl Harbor varies by nation. Japanese schools teach the attack but with different emphasis than American schools. Some emphasize strategic desperation. Others focus on militarism's disasters. Chinese and Korean perspectives emphasize Pearl Harbor as part of Japanese imperial aggression that devastated Asia. From these perspectives, Pearl Harbor is significant but not central to understanding Japanese wartime behavior. European perspectives often view Pearl Harbor as the event that brought America into World War II, enabling eventual victory. The attack guaranteed American participation that proved decisive in Europe. These different perspectives aren't contradictory but complementary. Pearl Harbor means different things to different nations. Understanding varied perspectives enriches historical comprehension. The question of responsibility remains contested. Most historians agree Japanese military leadership bears primary responsibility, but some argue American economic warfare left Japan feeling cornered. Others contend both nations share responsibility. The counterfactual questions are interesting. What if American carriers had been in port? What if the third wave had launched? Each alternate scenario might have produced different outcomes. These counterfactuals illuminate how contingent historical outcomes are. Small changes in timing or decisions can produce cascading effects. Pearl Harbor succeeded partly through meticulous planning and partly through luck. Understanding contingency helps avoid historical determinism. Pearl Harbor wasn't inevitable. American entry into World War II wasn't inevitable. Choices and chance shaped outcomes. The legacy ultimately comes down to how we choose to remember and learn. We can remember it as unprovoked treachery justifying eternal vigilance. We can remember it as preventable tragedy from intelligence failures. We can remember it as pivotal moment that transformed America. All have validity. But memory without learning is incomplete. Pearl Harbor offers lessons about intelligence analysis, strategic planning, resilience, reconciliation. Which lessons we prioritize depends on challenges we face and values we hold. The danger is applying Pearl Harbor's lessons inappropriately. Not every threat resembles Pearl Harbor. Not every intelligence warning indicates imminent attack. Seeing Pearl Harbor everywhere risks militarizing responses to problems requiring different approaches. Conversely, ignoring Pearl Harbor's lessons entirely is problematic. Intelligence failures still occur. Surprise attacks remain possible. The lesson isn't paranoia but prudence. The memorials attempt to balance these lessons. They honor the dead without glorifying war. They acknowledge significance without promoting militarism. They educate without indoctrinating. This balance is delicate but necessary. As we move further from 1941, maintaining this balance becomes harder. The living connection fades. Pearl Harbor risks becoming just another historical date. Preventing this requires active effort to keep memory alive and relevant. But relevance doesn't mean distortion. Pearl Harbor should be remembered as it actually was. The complexity, the failures, the heroism, the tragedy, all deserve acknowledgement. Selective memory dishonors those who experienced the actual events. The survivors who remain carry this burden of authentic memory. Their accounts provide corrective to simplified narratives. They remember not just the attack, but the confusion, the fear, the randomness of who lived and died. When the last survivor passes, which will happen soon, Pearl Harbor transitions fully from memory to history. The change is subtle but significant. History mediated through documents differs from history mediated through living witnesses. But endings create space for new beginnings. When Pearl Harbor becomes fully historical, new interpretations become possible. Distance allows perspective that proximity obscures. Future historians will see patterns we miss. This ongoing reinterpretation is how history remains vital. Pearl Harbor isn't frozen in 1941. It exists in continuous dialogue between past events and present understanding. The physical harbor continues serving dual purpose: active military base and historical memorial. Ships dock where ships sank. Sailors work where sailors died. The contrast between past and present creates productive tension. This dual identity models how societies can honor history while living in the present. We don't have to choose between remembering and building the future. Pearl Harbor demonstrates this possibility. The question for future generations is what Pearl Harbor will mean to them. For those alive in 1941, it meant personal experience. For their children, it meant stories from parents. For their grandchildren, it means history studied in school. For generations beyond, it will mean whatever society chooses to make it mean. That responsibility, to transmit significance to generations with no personal connection, falls on institutions and anyone who cares about how history is remembered. The work requires both fidelity to historical truth and creative engagement, with making distant events meaningful to contemporary audiences. Pearl Harbor will endure in American consciousness, though its meaning will evolve. The attack was too significant to fade into obscurity, but what it represents will change as each generation interprets it through their own concerns. Whether Pearl Harbor ultimately teaches vigilance or restraint, militarism or diplomacy, American exceptionalism or humility, depends on which aspects we emphasize and how we apply them. The event itself is fixed in history. The lessons we draw remain contested and contingent. And maybe that's the most important lesson. History doesn't hand us clear instructions for the present. It provides examples, cautionary tales, and inspiration. What we do with those depends on wisdom and circumstances that historians can inform but not determine. Pearl Harbor transformed December 7th, 1941 into a date that would live in infamy. It transformed a reluctant nation into a superpower. It transformed isolationism into global engagement. But transformation isn't destiny. The choices made after Pearl Harbor weren't inevitable. Different circumstances might have produced different outcomes. The path from Pearl Harbor to American global dominance wasn't predetermined. Understanding this contingency matters because it reminds us that current trajectories can change. The world shaped by Pearl Harbor's aftermath isn't permanent. Future events will transform it just as Pearl Harbor transformed what came before. We're not trapped by history even as we're shaped by it. The sailors who died at Pearl Harbor couldn't have imagined the world their deaths helped create. They couldn't have foreseen Japanese-American alliance, American bases across the Pacific, or countless ways World War II reshaped civilization. History moves in directions participants can't predict. The men fighting in 1941 were unwittingly creating conditions for developments they couldn't imagine. This gap between intention and outcome is fundamental to historical change. The harbour continues evolving. Ships sunk in 1941 deteriorate further each year. Memorials built in the 1960s require increasing maintenance. Nothing stays frozen in time. This physical impermanence mirrors historical impermanence. Pearl Harbor. The event is fixed. Pearl Harbor. The memory changes constantly. Each generation remembers differently based on distance from events and present concerns. Managing this transition from lived memory to historical event is one challenge facing Pearl Harbor's stewards. How do you keep December 7th, 1941 meaningful to people born decades after the last survivor dies? Part of the answer lies in connecting Pearl Harbor to contemporary relevance. The attack illuminates patterns in how nations compete, how intelligence fails, how surprise attacks succeed. These patterns remain relevant. Another part lies in universal human experiences Pearl Harbor represents: fear, courage, sacrifice, loss, resilience. These aren't limited to 1941. Pearl Harbor provides specific examples of these universals. The physical site provides irreplaceable value. Reading about courage is different from standing where courageous acts occurred. Physical presence creates connections that virtual experience struggles to match. But physical sites need interpretation and context. The oil leaking from Arizona is a powerful symbol, but it needs explanation. The sunken ship needs historical context to be meaningful beyond spectacle. This is where museums, educational programs, and interpretive materials become crucial. They bridge the gap between physical artifact and historical understanding. They explain not just what happened, but why it matters. They connect 1941 to present concerns and future challenges. The challenge is doing this without distorting history to serve contemporary agendas. Pearl Harbor should inform present thinking, not be retrofitted to validate predetermined conclusions. The temptation to use historical events as rhetorical weapons rather than learning opportunities is strong and must be resisted. Historians and educators face constant tension between accessibility and accuracy. Making history engaging sometimes tempts simplification that becomes distortion. Finding balance between engaging presentation and rigorous accuracy requires skill and integrity. Pearl Harbor has generally been served well by historians who take this responsibility seriously. The scholarship is extensive, rigorous, and increasingly sophisticated. The public history at the memorial sites is largely accurate if sometimes simplified. But vigilance is necessary to maintain these standards. The commercial pressures on historical sites create ongoing challenges. Pearl Harbor attracts millions of visitors, generating significant economic activity. This provides resources for preservation and education, but also creates temptation to prioritize revenue over mission. Finding appropriate balance requires constant attention. The memorial's success in maintaining this balance should be acknowledged. Despite commercial pressures, Pearl Harbor remains primarily educational and memorial rather than entertainment venue. Visitors generally come to learn and remember, not just to be entertained. The site's design and management support this purpose. As climate and environmental conditions change, Pearl Harbor will face new preservation challenges. Sea level rise threatens coastal memorials. Ocean acidification affects underwater wrecks. Changing weather patterns create new maintenance requirements. Adapting to these changes while maintaining memorial integrity will require creativity and resources. The question of what to do when physical artifacts deteriorate beyond preservation will eventually arise. Arizona won't last forever. At some point, the ship will collapse completely. What happens to the memorial then? Does it remain over empty water? Does it relocate? Does the memorial itself become the focus rather than the wreck beneath? These aren't immediate questions, but they're approaching. Planning for them now, while survivors still provide living connection to events, makes sense. Their input can shape decisions that future generations will implement. The digital preservation of Pearl Harbor's history offers both opportunities and challenges. Vast amounts of documentation, photographs, and oral histories are being digitized. This ensures preservation and enables global access. But digital archives require ongoing curation and maintenance. Formats become obsolete. Storage media degrades. Preserving digital materials requires active effort. The potential for immersive digital experiences continues growing. Virtual reality could eventually allow people to experience Pearl Harbor with remarkable fidelity. Augmented reality could overlay historical information on current landscapes. These technologies might provide engagement that physical visits alone can't match. But technology can't replace authentic connection to physical sites and real artifacts. The power of standing where history occurred remains unique. Technology should supplement, not replace, physical engagement with historical sites. Pearl Harbor ultimately represents intersection of past and present, memory and history, personal experience and collective understanding. It's where abstract historical forces became concrete in individual lives. It's where strategic decisions resulted in human tragedy and transformation. It's where the past remains visible in the present through memorials, artifacts, and ongoing consequences. The story of Pearl Harbor isn't over. It continues evolving as new generations interpret events, as scholarship advances, as memorials age and adapt, as lessons are learned and sometimes forgotten and relearned. History isn't static, neither is Pearl Harbor. What remains constant is the significance of December 7th, 1941 as a pivotal moment in American and world history. The attack changed everything. Understanding how and why it changed things helps us navigate our own moment of historical change. That's what makes Pearl Harbor worth remembering and studying and visiting. Not just what happened then, but what it means now and might mean in futures we can't yet imagine. This is where museums and educational programs become crucial. They bridge the gap between physical artifact and historical understanding. They explain not just what happened, but why it matters. The challenge is doing this without distorting history to serve contemporary agendas. Pearl Harbor should inform present thinking, not be retrofitted to validate predetermined conclusions. The temptation to use historical events as rhetorical weapons rather than learning opportunities is strong. Historians and educators face constant tension between accessibility and accuracy. Making history engaging sometimes tempts simplification that becomes distortion. Finding balance requires skill and integrity. Pearl Harbor has generally been served well by historians who take this responsibility seriously. The scholarship is extensive and increasingly sophisticated. The public history at memorial sites is largely accurate if sometimes simplified. The commercial pressures create ongoing challenges. Pearl Harbor attracts millions of visitors, generating significant economic activity. This provides resources but also creates temptation to prioritize revenue over mission. The memorial's success in maintaining balance should be acknowledged. Despite commercial pressures, Pearl Harbor remains primarily educational rather than entertainment venue. The site's design and management support this purpose. As climate conditions change, Pearl Harbor will face new preservation challenges. Sea level rise threatens coastal memorials. Ocean acidification affects underwater wrecks. Adapting to these changes while maintaining integrity will require creativity and resources. The question of what to do when physical artifacts deteriorate beyond preservation will eventually arise. Arizona won't last forever. At some point, the ship will collapse completely. What happens to the memorial then? These aren't immediate questions, but they're approaching. Planning for them now, while survivors still provide living connection, makes sense. Their input can shape decisions that future generations will implement. The digital preservation offers both opportunities and challenges. Vast amounts of documentation and oral histories are being digitized. This ensures preservation and enables global access. But digital archives require ongoing curation and maintenance. The potential for immersive digital experiences continues growing. Virtual reality could eventually allow people to experience Pearl Harbor with remarkable fidelity. Augmented reality could overlay historical information on current landscapes. But technology can't replace authentic connection to physical sites. The power of standing where history occurred remains unique. Technology should supplement, not replace, physical engagement. Pearl Harbor represents intersection of past and present, memory and history, personal experience and collective understanding. It's where abstract historical forces became concrete in individual lives. It's where strategic decisions resulted in human tragedy and transformation. The story of Pearl Harbor isn't over. It continues evolving as new generations interpret events, as scholarship advances, as memorials age and adapt. History isn't static. Neither is Pearl Harbor. What remains constant is the significance of December 7th, 1941 as pivotal moment. The attack changed everything. Understanding how and why helps us navigate our own moment of historical change. That's what makes Pearl Harbor worth remembering. Not just what happened then, but what it means now and might mean in futures we can't yet imagine. The attack demonstrated that no nation, however powerful, is invulnerable. America discovered this the hard way. The lesson applies universally. Confidence is valuable, but hubris is dangerous. Security requires vigilance without paranoia. Pearl Harbor also showed how quickly circumstances can change. In a single morning, America transformed from neutral observer to committed combatant. The pace of historical change can be breathtaking. What seems stable can shift dramatically. This applies to contemporary situations. The international order shaped by World War II and the Cold War is changing. American dominance isn't permanent. Chinese power grows. European unity faces challenges. The Middle East remains unstable. Climate change threatens unprecedented disruption. Pearl Harbor teaches that preparing for change is wiser than assuming stability. Not through militarism or fear, but through clear-eyed assessment of threats and opportunities. Adaptation beats rigidity. Flexibility outperforms dogmatism. The reconciliation between America and Japan demonstrates that former enemies can become partners. This wasn't inevitable or easy. It required conscious choices by leaders on both sides. It required populations willing to move past grievances. This model of reconciliation offers hope for other conflicts. If America and Japan can overcome Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima, other nations can overcome their histories. But it requires conditions that don't always exist. Mutual interest helps. Total victory by one side clarifies power dynamics. Economic interdependence creates practical reasons for cooperation. Without these conditions, reconciliation becomes much harder. The US-Japan model can't be copied mechanically to other situations, but it demonstrates that reconciliation is possible when both sides commit to it. The human cost of Pearl Harbor deserves constant remembrance. 403 Americans died. Each one was an individual with family, friends, dreams, and potential. Reducing them to statistics dishonors their memory. They deserve to be remembered as people, not numbers. The Japanese airmen who died also deserve acknowledgement. They were following orders, serving their country as they understood their duty. Their deaths were tragic, even if their cause was unjust. War kills people on all sides. Mourning our dead doesn't require celebrating theirs, but it should include acknowledging their humanity. This broader perspective doesn't excuse Japanese aggression or minimize American suffering. It simply recognizes that war creates tragedy universally. Understanding this helps prevent future wars while honoring those who fought in past ones. The families who lost loved ones at Pearl Harbor carried that loss for lifetimes. Gold Star mothers and widows and orphaned children lived with absence that never fully healed. Their sacrifice extended far beyond December 7th, 1941. They lived with consequences for decades. Honoring the fallen means honoring these families too. The memorials serve them as much as anyone. They provide places to mourn, to remember, to find meaning in loss. This function is as important as any educational mission. As these family members age and pass away, the personal connection to Pearl Harbor's victims fades. Eventually, no one will remember these men personally. They'll exist only in photographs, documents, and official records. The transition from personal memory to historical record is inevitable but nonetheless poignant. This makes preservation of individual stories increasingly important. Not just casualty statistics, but actual biographies. Who were these men? What were their lives like before December 7th, 1941? What potential was lost when they died? Some efforts have been made to collect these biographies. The National Park Service maintains databases with information about victims. Families have contributed photographs and memories, but much has been lost to time. The incomplete record reminds us that history is always partial. The attack's racial dimensions deserve continued examination. The immediate response included internment of Japanese Americans, one of the darkest episodes in American history. Fear and racism combined to produce injustice that took decades to acknowledge. But the war also created opportunities for African Americans to challenge discrimination. The contradiction between fighting fascism abroad and maintaining segregation at home became increasingly difficult to justify. Pearl Harbor indirectly contributed to the civil rights movement by highlighting these contradictions. For Native Americans, the war presented complex choices. Should they fight for a government that had oppressed them? Many chose to serve despite this history. Their service demonstrated patriotism even in the face of historical injustice. These racial dynamics shaped the war and its aftermath in ways that continue affecting American society. Pearl Harbor was part of that larger story. Understanding the attack means understanding these contexts. The role of women also deserves attention. While men fought, women worked in defense industries, joined auxiliary military services, and kept the home front functioning. Their contributions were essential to victory. Pearl Harbor initiated mobilization that transformed women's roles. Rosie the Riveter became iconic, representing women's wartime work. This wasn't permanent revolution in gender roles. After the war, many women returned to domestic roles. But the experience created precedents that later feminist movements built upon. The economic transformations initiated by Pearl Harbor reshaped American capitalism. Government spending reached unprecedented levels. Business and government collaboration intensified. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower later warned about began forming. This partnership between government and industry produced technological marvels and economic growth. It also created dependencies and distortions. Defense spending became a permanent feature of the economy. Industries oriented toward military contracts. Regions became dependent on bases and procurement. Whether this was beneficial depends on perspective. The economy grew, living standards rose, America became wealthy beyond previous imagination. But resources went to military purposes that might have addressed domestic needs. The opportunity costs were real. The scientific legacy extends beyond military applications. Wartime research advanced medicine, materials science, communications, and countless other fields. University research received massive funding that continued after the war. The scientific establishment that dominates American universities traces to wartime mobilization. This created world-leading research capabilities. American universities became magnets for global talent. Scientific breakthroughs followed. But the military orientation of much research created ethical challenges and skewed priorities toward applications with military value. The post-war international order shaped by World War II is now fading. The United Nations, World Bank, IMF, all products of Allied victory, face challenges. American leadership is questioned. The liberal international order that seemed permanent is contested. Pearl Harbor helped create this order by bringing America into the war that reshaped global politics. What comes after this order depends on choices being made now. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The challenges of managing great power competition while avoiding catastrophic war remain relevant. China's rise particularly evokes parallels to pre-World War II Japan. A non-Western power challenging Western-dominated order, resource needs driving expansion, nationalism fueling assertiveness. The parallels aren't perfect, but they're concerning. The question is whether this competition must end in conflict or can be managed peacefully. Pearl Harbor teaches that great powers can blunder into wars through miscalculation and escalation. Avoiding that outcome requires wisdom that wasn't present in 1941. Economic interdependence between America and China far exceeds anything that existed with Japan. This creates strong incentives to avoid conflict, but it didn't prevent World War I despite similar interdependence in Europe. Economic ties aren't foolproof peace guarantees. The intelligence failures at Pearl Harbor resonate in contemporary concerns about surprise attacks. Cyber warfare creates new vulnerabilities. Terrorism remains a threat. Biological weapons could cause catastrophic damage. Nuclear weapons still exist in dangerous quantities. The lesson isn't that attacks are inevitable, but that vigilance is necessary. Intelligence agencies work constantly to detect and prevent threats. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. The nature of intelligence work means successes rarely make headlines, but failures always do. This creates unrealistic expectations. Intelligence agencies can't predict everything. Demanding perfect foresight sets impossible standards. But expecting reasonable competence and learning from failures is fair. The comparison between Pearl Harbor and 9/11 intelligence failures remains instructive. In both cases, information existed that in hindsight pointed to attacks. In both cases, that information wasn't properly synthesized or acted upon. The mechanisms of failure differ, but the pattern repeats. Learning from these failures means understanding how organizations process information, how cognitive biases affect analysis, how bureaucratic structures can inhibit communication. These are perennial challenges without perfect solutions, but awareness helps. The Pearl Harbor attack also teaches about the limitations of deterrence. American forces in Hawaii were meant to deter Japanese aggression. They failed. Deterrence isn't automatic or foolproof. It requires credible capability and clear communication of willingness to use that capability. During the Cold War, nuclear deterrence prevented direct conflict between superpowers. Whether this vindicated deterrence theory or just got lucky remains debated. The fact that nuclear war didn't occur doesn't prove deterrence worked. Maybe it worked. Maybe we got lucky. We can't run controlled experiments. Contemporary deterrence challenges include cyber attacks, grey zone conflicts, and non-state actors who don't follow traditional deterrence logic. The lessons from Pearl Harbor about conventional military deterrence may not fully apply to these newer threats. But the basic insight that deterrence requires both capability and credibility remains valid. Threats that aren't believed won't deter. Capabilities that can't be used effectively won't deter. Finding the right balance is a perennial challenge of statecraft. The memorialization of Pearl Harbor will continue evolving. New technologies will enable different forms of engagement. Changing demographics will bring different perspectives. The passing of the World War II generation will shift the tone from memory to history. How future generations choose to remember Pearl Harbor depends on what they find relevant. If international conflict remains central concern, Pearl Harbor's lessons about surprise attack and intelligence failure stay relevant. If climate change becomes the dominant challenge, Pearl Harbor's lessons about mobilization and transformation may resonate more. The flexibility of historical meaning isn't relativism. Facts remain facts. But which facts we emphasize and how we interpret them depends on present concerns. This is how history remains vital rather than ossified. Pearl Harbor's physical site will require increasing resources to maintain. The Park Service budget faces constraints. Private fundraising can supplement but not replace public support. Maintaining Pearl Harbor as meaningful memorial and educational site requires sustained commitment. The American public broadly supports Pearl Harbor commemoration, but translating that general support into specific budget allocations requires advocacy and political will. Competing priorities always exist. Making the case for Pearl Harbor's continued importance is an ongoing task. International visitors bring different perspectives that enrich understanding. Japanese visitors often express complex emotions about the site. They honor American dead while grappling with their nation's role. This discomfort is valuable. Easy answers should make us suspicious. Chinese and Korean visitors view Pearl Harbor through lens of Japanese aggression in Asia. Their perspective emphasizes Pearl Harbor as one piece of much broader Japanese imperialism. This contextualizes the attack differently than American narratives typically do. European visitors often focus on Pearl Harbor as an event that brought America into war that saved Europe. Their gratitude is real, but also simplifies complex history. American entry into World War II served American interests as much as it saved Europe. These different perspectives don't contradict each other so much as illuminate different facets of complex historical events. Engaging with multiple viewpoints enriches understanding even when they create discomfort. The educators who teach about Pearl Harbor face challenging tasks. Making 80-year-old events meaningful to teenagers requires creativity. Some teachers excel at this. Others struggle to move beyond textbook facts. Effective education connects historical events to students' lives. How do surprise attacks work? What does intelligence failure look like? These questions have contemporary relevance. Primary sources bring history to life. Reading actual letters from sailors creates connection to real people. Looking at photographs makes events tangible. Listening to oral histories puts human faces on historical abstractions. Technology enables access to these primary sources. Digital archives make materials available globally. Students can examine documents that previously required visiting specific archives, but access alone doesn't guarantee understanding. Students need guidance in interpreting sources, understanding context, and avoiding anachronistic judgments. The role of Pearl Harbor in patriotic education deserves examination. The attack often gets presented as unprovoked treachery that unified a righteous nation. This narrative serves patriotic purposes but oversimplifies reality. Patriotic education isn't necessarily bad. Societies need shared narratives, but patriotism based on historical distortion is fragile. Better to build patriotism on honest history. Pearl Harbor can support patriotic education without distortion. The attack was aggressive and devastating. The American response demonstrated resilience. The eventual victory was hard-earned. These facts support appropriate national pride. The military's use of Pearl Harbor as cautionary tale serves important functions. Teaching officers about intelligence failures and strategic miscalculation helps prevent similar mistakes. But military education about Pearl Harbor risks becoming ritualistic. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," can become empty slogan. What exactly should be remembered? What specific mistakes should be avoided? Good military education focuses on concrete lessons. How do you ensure intelligence reaches decision-makers? How do you maintain readiness? These specific questions have practical applications. The question of whether Pearl Harbor was preventable continues generating debate. Some argue that better intelligence analysis could have detected and countered the attack. Others contend that Japanese operational security was too good for prevention to be realistic. The truth probably lies between extremes. Complete prevention seems unlikely. But some mitigation was possible. Better intelligence might have prompted higher alert levels. Better disposition of forces might have reduced damage. This matters because the lesson changes. If the attack was truly unavoidable, the lesson is about resilience. If better performance could have prevented it, the lesson is about organizational competence. The counterfactual world where Pearl Harbor didn't occur is fascinating. Without the attack, would America have entered World War II? Perhaps eventually, but timing and circumstances would have differed dramatically. Without American entry in December 1941, the war might have lasted years longer. Nazi Germany might have defeated the Soviet Union. Japan might have consolidated control over Asia. This underscores how contingent historical outcomes are. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor shaped world history in ways Japanese planners never imagined. Their goal was tactical advantage. The result was American global dominance for generations. Pearl Harbor specifically teaches that military actions have political consequences that may outweigh tactical results. Japan won tactically on December 7, 1941. They lost the war that victory helped start. This lesson applies to contemporary military operations. Winning battles doesn't guarantee winning wars. The relationship between military means and political ends requires constant attention. The attack demonstrates how single events can shift historical trajectories. December 7th, 1941 was a hinge point. Before it, America was hesitant about the war. After it, America was committed. One day changed everything. When the last person with personal memory of December 7th, 1941 dies, Pearl Harbor will transition fully into history. This transition is already underway. Most people alive today have no personal connection to World War II. This transition brings losses and opportunities. The loss of direct testimony means future understanding will rely on documents and artifacts. But distance enables perspective that proximity obscures. Future historians may see patterns in Pearl Harbor that current analysts miss. They may ask questions that haven't occurred to us. Historical understanding evolves as each generation reinterprets the past. The ultimate significance of Pearl Harbor lies not in any single interpretation, but in its capacity to teach across generations. The attack was military operation, strategic miscalculation, intelligence failure, human tragedy, catalyst for transformation, and countless other things simultaneously. Each generation finds different meanings in Pearl Harbor because each generation faces different challenges. Those who lived through World War II saw it as a defining moment of their lives. Their children saw it as parents' story that shaped the world they inherited. Their grandchildren see it as important history that explains how America became a superpower. Future generations will find their own meanings. They'll ask questions that seem obvious to them but haven't occurred to us. They'll draw connections we can't yet see. They'll interpret Pearl Harbor through concerns and frameworks that don't yet exist. This ongoing reinterpretation isn't distortion. It's how history remains vital. Static history becomes irrelevant. Living. History evolves while remaining grounded in facts. Pearl Harbor, the event is fixed. Pearl Harbor, the meaning continues developing. The physical site will continue aging and changing. Arizona will eventually collapse completely. The memorial will require major restoration or replacement. The harbor itself will be affected by climate change and development. Nothing physical lasts forever. But the historical significance transcends physical artifacts. Even when every ship has corroded away and every memorial has crumbled, December 7th, 1941 will remain important. The attack's significance derives from its effects, not from physical remnants. This is why education and scholarship matter more than preservation alone. Physical sites help, but they're not sufficient. Understanding why Pearl Harbor matters requires intellectual engagement that transcends tourism. The goal isn't just remembering that the attack happened, but understanding what it meant and means. The challenge for Pearl Harbor's stewards is maintaining this intellectual engagement across generations. How do you keep people thinking about Pearl Harbor rather than just visiting it? How do you promote understanding rather than just remembrance? Part of the answer lies in connecting Pearl Harbor to ongoing concerns. The attack illuminates patterns of intelligence failure, international conflict, surprise attacks, and national trauma that remain relevant. These connections make Pearl Harbor more than historical curiosity. Another part lies in honest acknowledgement of complexity. Pearl Harbor wasn't simple good versus evil story. It was a complicated event with multiple causes, perspectives, and consequences. Honoring that complexity produces deeper understanding than simplified narratives. The survivors who remain deserve final acknowledgement. They carried memories of December 7th, 1941 for their entire lives. They shared those memories with historians, educators, and family members. They ensured that Pearl Harbor wouldn't be forgotten or reduced to abstraction. Their passing marks an ending. But endings create new beginnings. When personal memory gives way to historical understanding, new forms of engagement become possible. The transition is natural and necessary, even if poignant. Pearl Harbor will endure in American consciousness for generations. The attack was too significant, too dramatic, too consequential to fade into obscurity. But how it's remembered will continue evolving as circumstances change and new generations interpret the past. One truth endures regardless of how interpretations change. On December 7th, 1941, a harbor in Hawaii became site of attack that changed world history. The men who died that morning couldn't have imagined the world their deaths helped create. The nation that was attacked that morning emerged from the resulting war as the most powerful in history. Whether that power was used wisely, whether the lessons learned were appropriate, whether the consequences were worth the costs, these questions remain contested. But the historical importance isn't disputed. Pearl Harbor mattered enormously and continues mattering. The harbor itself, that natural lagoon that drew strategic interest over a century ago, continues serving the nation. Ships still dock there, sailors still work there. The military mission continues while memorials ensure the attack isn't forgotten. This dual identity, working base and historical memorial, creates productive tension. The harbour isn't frozen in 1941. It's living, working, changing while also remembering. This models how societies should engage with history, honouring the past while living in the present and building the future. The story of Pearl Harbor doesn't end. It continues evolving as new generations add their interpretations to the accumulated understanding. Each generation inherits history from their predecessors and passes it to their successors, modified by their own perspectives and concerns. This transmission of historical memory across generations is how societies maintain continuity while adapting to change. Pearl Harbor connects us to the past while informing the present and shaping the future. That's what makes it worth remembering, studying, and visiting. The attack transformed a Sunday morning into a date that would live in infamy. It transformed a hesitant nation into a determined superpower. It transformed the world in ways that continue affecting us decades later. Understanding that transformation helps us navigate our own moment of historical change. And maybe that's the final lesson Pearl Harbor teaches. History doesn't repeat, but it provides patterns and precedents. The challenges we face won't be identical to those of 1941, but they'll rhyme with them. Understanding how previous generations navigated their challenges helps us navigate ours. Pearl Harbor demonstrates that unexpected events can shift trajectories dramatically. It shows that intelligence failures occur even with massive resources devoted to prevention. It proves that resilience can overcome catastrophic setbacks. It illustrates how former enemies can become partners. It reminds us that unintended consequences often dwarf intended ones. These lessons remain relevant regardless of how much time passes. The specific threats change, but underlying patterns persist. Human nature doesn't change even when technology does. Organizations still fail in similar ways. Leaders still make decisions under uncertainty. Nations still compete for power and resources. Pearl Harbor illuminates these enduring patterns through specific historical example. That's what makes it valuable beyond mere remembrance. It's not just what happened then, but what it teaches us about how the world works. The men who died at Pearl Harbor deserve honor and remembrance. Their families deserve recognition of their sacrifice. The survivors deserve acknowledgement of their service and trauma. These human elements should never be forgotten or reduced to abstractions. But honoring the dead and survivors means more than remembrance. It means learning from their experience. It means understanding what happened and why, so we can make better choices going forward. It means taking seriously the responsibility of living in the world their sacrifice helped create. Whether Pearl Harbor ultimately represents warning, inspiration, tragedy, or transformation depends on what we choose to see and how we apply those insights. The event itself is fixed in history. The meaning we make from it remains open and contested. That openness is appropriate. History should inform but not dictate present choices. Pearl Harbor provides example, not instruction manual. What we do with that example depends on wisdom we bring to interpreting it. The harbour that was attacked on December 7, 1941 continues evolving. Ships rust and are replaced. Memorials age and are restored. The ecology changes. Human memory fades and is replaced by historical understanding. Nothing stays frozen except the date and the facts of what occurred. But frozen facts still speak across time. They tell us that unexpected events shape history, that nations stumble into wars, that resilience overcomes setbacks, that reconciliation is possible, that memory serves the living as much as it honours the dead. These truths remain constant even as interpretations evolve. Pearl Harbor will mean different things to different generations, but it will continue meaning something as long as people study history and learn from it. That's not insignificant. That's how the past informs the present and shapes the future. And that's worth remembering, worth studying, worth visiting Pearl Harbor to understand. Not just what happened that Sunday morning, but what it means for every morning that follows,